I've lived the life of a 200-year-old woman. I'm surprised I'm still alive. I probably could say I had a daddy wound because my father was absent all the time. But I was always looking for that male figure to protect me.
It's 1968, and Wendy Mazares is 13 years old, running wild in rural Nevada.
Las Vegas was a great place to grow up during the 60s and 70s.
Vegas was sort of a Hollywood playground. The Rat Pack was here, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Marilyn Monroe. But meanwhile, it was a small town with small town friendliness.
My parents did the best they could with what they had. My mother was gone from 5:30 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. She had top security clearance to Area 51.
Area 51 is a U.S. Air Force military installation in southern Nevada and the birthplace of the nuclear bomb.
My mother always kept a tight lip on what she did, and she would always make sure and call home to tell us when a bomb was going to go off because the entire house would rattle. My father was a truck driver. He was an absent father because he was on the road so much. We probably saw him once a week, if that.
When they do see their dad, he is often drunk and abusive to Wendy and her siblings.
Dad, I think probably due to his drinking, picked on one particular kid and her brother, Michael.
One time, Michael snuck me out of the window, and we went out for a little bit, came back, and my father started calling me horrible names. He called me a whore. At one point, he had my brother up in the corner. He had his hands around his neck, and he was choking him. And my mother had just walked in the house, and she'd taken off her shoe, and she started hitting my father with the heel on his head to make him get off Michael.
Wendy dreams of escaping the abusive household and turns to the glamour of downtown Las Vegas.
I was about 14 when we started taking the bus down to Fremont Street.
Fremont Street was where the Horseshoe was, the Pioneer Saloon, and there was a Woolworth store at one of the corners where she and her friends would hang out.
One day, we took a trip into Las Vegas. We went in the Horseshoe Club because Teddy Binion was a nice-looking guy, and he walked up to us and offered us some ice cream.
He immediately had his arm around her waist. He obviously focused on her because she's very beautiful. She loved that attention and this sort of sense of respect that she felt she hadn't gotten anywhere before.
Teddy is the 26-year-old son of Benny Binion, the owner of the Horseshoe Casino.
Benny Binion was maybe the most famous at that time casino owner in all of Las Vegas. The Horseshoe was renowned for basically no-limit betting, and he took all bets.
I was hanging out with Teddy till late in the evening, and eventually it led into a romantic time.
Wendy is 15 at this point, but she looks much older, and soon her relationship with Teddy turns sexual.
Thought I was an adult, and I thought I could do it on my own. And I would go home, and my parents would be very upset because it was way past curfew, and my parents had enough, and they were going to take me to juvenile home. I ran, and I called Teddy. Teddy hid me up in the casino. He started buying me nice clothes, jewelry, sent me to the beauty salon, and he started sitting me with gamblers, high rollers that would fly in. I would sit at the $1 million poker tournaments. It definitely made me feel that I was finally wanted.
Wendy becomes known as Teddy's girl and is on top of the world until Wendy's mother finds out and reports it to the police.
A detective started coming into the Horseshoe Club asking about me and if anyone had seen me. Teddy told me the heat's getting too hot. We're gonna have to move you to keep you safe. And so he introduced me to this good friend of theirs out of Texas. And he said, go with him for a couple weeks until the heat dies down. Before I left, Teddy says, oh, you'll love Texas. You'll ride some of his horses, drink some lemonade, and just kick back in the sun and enjoy yourself. And it wasn't at all what I expected.
Teddy's friend takes her to a seedy Texas motel.
Well, he said, now you need to work.
You told her, Teddy told me, you'd be like breaking in a new horse.
I didn't know what he was talking about until they took me back into a room with about 3 other girls. And they were trying to calm me down. I was crying. I didn't know where I was. It was very, very scary.
Wendy realizes she's been forced into the sex trade.
Well, the girls started telling me that when the phone rings, we take turns. And I went to the room. A man started telling me what to do and what he wanted, and I didn't really understand everything. I was used horribly.
Wendy is forced to have sex with oil riggers and cowboys for 3 weeks.
My feeling at the time was, I need to get myself through this so I can live. There was one gal there that really cared about me. She showed me a little window in the bathroom. It was just a little tiny one, but I was so skinny then anyway. And so she helped me escape. And when I got to the highway and the cowboy with the white hat in the pickup truck pulled over, I felt relieved. I felt I'm in good hands now.
A few days later, Wendy arrives back in Vegas shattered, homeless and broke.
It felt good that I was back in Las Vegas, but I couldn't go home in fear I was going to be placed in juvenile home. So I called Teddy, and then Teddy took me back to the club. I truly believe Teddy never knew that was going to happen.
Wendy is a problem for Teddy. She's still underage, and her mother might call the police again if he continues their relationship. But he has a solution.
Teddy said, I'm going to get you a job with another good friend of ours here in Vegas, and we're going to make sure that nothing like this happens to you again.
Teddy makes a few phone calls and then takes Wendy to a restaurant to meet one of his business associates.
Teddy said, that's him right there. Go up and introduce yourself. Tom had his very own booth. All the waitresses knew who he was. I said, Mr. Hanley? He said, yep, what's left of him? He was distinguished, and he had this great smile that made me feel warm. I looked into his eyes. They were stark blue, like they just jabbed right through you, and it gave me chills down my spine. He was a nice older gentleman.
Tom is the owner of an air conditioning company and also does work for the culinary union that represents Las Vegas workers.
We sat down and talked a little bit. People in the restaurant treated him with utmost respect, and that impressed me. He started telling me he needed a receptionist to just answer the phone, no pressure, no nothing. So I said, I can do that, that's great. could have been a little job, but it still made me feel good about myself. Teddy did ask him, now she's going to be in good hands, right, Tom? Tom said, of course she will.
And that began her relationship with one of the most notorious hitmen in Las Vegas history.
Wendy Mazzares is thankful for her new job with businessman Tom Hanley, who has taken her under his protective wing.
The following day, I rode with him in the truck. He took me to the business, and there was no one there. It was just Tom and I. And I sat there and waited, but the phone never rang. And it was a pretty boring job, but I was still happy to have it.
Tom seems pleased to have company. Only 3 months earlier, he lost his wife of 40 years to a suspicious overdose of sleeping pills. His 36-year-old son, Granby, lives nearby and works with Tom, who lives alone.
Tom's house was an older home, but it was a nice home.
The job comes with room and board, so Wendy moves in with her new boss.
He made me feel comfortable. I thought he was a gentleman. I felt good inside. I felt good inside about the whole situation. I felt like Tom was definitely giving me a chance to straighten out my life.
Wendy settles into a routine, far from the abuse she suffered at her parents' and in the Texas brothel. But before long, she learns the true nature of Tom's work and why the phone never rings. His air conditioning company is a cover for something far less cool.
One day, Tom took me to a restaurant on Maryland Parkway, which everyone in Vegas knew the gangsters hung out. And when we left, I said, what are you doing in a restaurant like that? He says, I work for the mob. I was floored. I really didn't know what to say because one minute he has the air conditioning business and the next minute he's working for the mob.
Tom Hanley's connection to the culinary union and to mobsters made him a powerful force in Las Vegas. A feared force, actually, more than respected.
And suddenly it started making sense why Tony Spilotro would show up at our home.
Tony Spilotro, people will know basically as Joe Pesci from the movie Casino.
Go get my money or I'll put your brain to sleep.
He was considered like an enforcer. People feared him for that.
Tom's son Granby works with Tony Spilotro in the infamous hole-in-the-wall gang, burglarizing jewelry stores.
Granby was a heroin addict. He was just very unpredictable and scary. One time, Tony Spilotro and his brother came out to the office. They wanted something from Tom. And Tom said, you want something? Here's something, you little. And he started shooting at Tony and his brother's feet and telling them to dance. And then they turned around and ran to their car, screaming at Tom, you crazy old man, you crazy old man.
Wendy realizes that even violent mobsters are fearful of Tom. And while she is under his protection, no one will ever mess with her again.
Tom made me feel very stable. He had a knack for that. He gave me lots of pretty jewelry. One day he asked if he could kiss me, and then it just went from there. Finally, I just gave in to Tom because he did make me feel secure. He was taking care of me, and he was looking out for my best interest.
Tom is 58 and Wendy is 19 when he asks her to marry him in 1976.
He said, you know, we really need to get married and get married Western style. And I said, okay, that sounds great. When Tom proposed to me, I felt a little bit more secure. I know how sick that sounds, but I felt more secure because I figured if I was his wife, then he wouldn't hurt me.
You know, you've heard of sort of the Oedipus complex. He was the father she never had, and she was this incredibly beautiful young woman to him.
We went and got a marriage license down in Las Vegas. We went to a ranch in Colorado.
Wendy is not on great terms with her family, and none of them are invited to the wedding.
He had some clergymen come in, and I was dressed in a red square dancing outfit, and he was dressed in his Western attire. We said our vows, and we were married. It was nice. After we got back from being married, Tom scooped up all the beautiful gowns I had, and he burned them. An overwhelming feeling came over me that, wow, maybe he does care, maybe he's doing it for a reason. Maybe that life that I was living prior, I'll never go back to.
But this was not done with good intentions. In fact, this is the first sign that Tom will not be Wendy's protector, but her new controller.
I had left to go up to meet an old friend, and he had followed me. When I got back, I walked through the front door, and he was there with his fist clenched, and he was shaking, screaming, "Where have you been? I'm gonna knock your head off if you don't tell me the truth." That was one of the first times that I saw Tom in such a fit of rage. I felt, this guy's really gonna kill me. He's really going to kill me. It just terrified me.
She couldn't really have friends because he didn't want her talking to anybody about anything that happened.
After that, he never let me out of his sight. I was always with him, or I was with someone he knew.
Tension escalates one day when Wendy notices some jewelry Tom has given her is missing. Tom's son Granby, the jewel thief, is her first suspect.
I stormed out of the house, walked over to Granby's, knocked on the door. I said, "Where's my jewelry? I know you took it." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "I'm gonna call the cops." And that was the worst thing I could have said. He was going to kill me right then and there. And he jumped on top of me, and he was literally strangling me. I was going in and out, and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was dead. And the next thing I knew, Tom was there knocking Granby off of me. And Tom said that I better be quiet and not talk to anyone, not say anything, or he's gonna come and get me. It put chills down my spine, and it literally terrified me.
Wendy Mazaris's marriage to Las Vegas mobster Tom Hanley has become an exercise in survival.
I felt more and more trapped. I felt like I was digging a deeper and deeper hole.
And Wendy's ties to Tom are about to be made deeper.
When I found out I was pregnant, I felt relieved again. If I'm pregnant, he's not going to threaten to kill me anymore. Tom was very, very happy that I was pregnant. He said, "Oh, you're going to have a little gooser. I'm so happy for us." And it made me feel good that he felt good.
But Wendy is reminded that no one is safe from Tom, not even the mother of his child, when she stumbles on a keepsake from his past.
I was rearranging Tom's suits, and I found this note. It was his first wife's suicide note.
Officially, Tom's first wife died from an overdose of sleeping pills. But does this note tell another story? Wendy's gut reaction is to give the note to Tom, but she immediately regrets this.
Tom sat me down and said, now you're going to write yours. And I said, why are you having me do this? He said, just write it. And so he told me what to say. Sorry, Tom, I can't go on anymore. Make sure our little gooser is well taken care of. What was going through my head at the time was, wow. I immediately went into survival mode again. I felt extremely insecure.
What kind of psychotic person does that who has his wife write a suicide note?
The suicide note was used to keep me under control. I was like his prisoner, and I would always have it in the back of my head that he has that suicide note. He can kill me at any minute.
In the winter of 1976, Wendy gives birth to a baby girl they name Amy.
I thought having a daughter, he would change a little bit, but he didn't. Tom started going to the deep end then. He started acting out, started just walking around like no one could touch him, started being mean to the people that he was around. We were at the Safeway store shopping. We were up at the cash register. Some guy had let me in because I had a new baby. He said, please go first. Tom took that completely wrong, pulled out his gun, stuck it to the guy's head, and said, don't talk to my wife. And the next thing I knew, we were running out of the store with this little baby.
Tom is quickly arrested and taken to the station while police conduct a search at the house.
One detective said, are there any more guns in the house? And I said, yeah, there's a lot. And I took him in, and they loaded up like 56 guns out of our room alone. Tom was up at the sheriff's office. They had not put him in a cell. They had not booked him. He called and he was screaming at the detective, leave my guns alone. I want my guns and I'll be home in a minute. And they let him go. That made me think that Tom was very powerful with the sheriff's office, and he had connections there. They didn't even book him. They gave him back all of his guns, and they let him come home. All I wanted to do was take the baby and run. But at that point, I felt it was impossible because he would hunt me down and he would kill me. He had the suicide note, and he carried it around in his wallet.
Soon, Wendy will be digging her own grave, literally.
He tells her, dig more, make it deeper, and she is frightened. He is renowned as a killer. You know this now for a fact, and you think you're digging your own grave. What else could she think other than he's gonna put bullets in the back of her head?
Hitman Tom Hanley's powerful influence over the police and the mob turns his wife Wendy into a prisoner. Wendy tries to normalize her life by focusing on happier moments. She relishes the times they spend with their close friends, Al and Barbara Bramlett.
We went to Barbara's house and had dinner. I liked Al too. I thought he was nice. Making sure my pregnancy went okay and always asking questions how I felt. He seemed like a pretty genuine gentleman.
Al is the head of the Culinary Union, and its members are 25,000 strong.
Al Bramlett was the top person for Culinary 226. It's the most powerful union in Las Vegas, representing casino workers. He also uses that position to exert enormous influence and power to enrich himself and also to inflict violence on people who didn't bow to his will. Al Bramlett also used Tom Hanley to threaten people who didn't unionize.
It seemed to me that Tom really liked Al. He was one of his best friends of 36 years.
In late February 1977, Tom comes home unusually late one night.
He came in, gave me a big hug and said, "I love you." Then he walked to the laundry room, took off his clothes and put them in the washer. You could see little spits of blood on them. Then he pulled out this jewelry, and one was a tiger ring. Later on, we got a call from Al Bramlett's wife, Barbara. Barbara was asking Tom, "Have you seen Al? He didn't get off the plane."
When the media learns Al Bramlett is missing, it's big news.
We have checked with a number of persons who were closely associated with Mr. Bramlett. We have been unable to come up with any reason as to his disappearance.
I saw it on the news that Al Bramlett didn't come home. At that point, I thought, tiger ring. That scared me right there. Could have Tom gone and hurt Al? Where was he gone for so long? I thought to myself, he couldn't have. He couldn't have killed one of his best friends of 36 years. He couldn't have hurt him. What did he do? The following day when we woke up, there was a detective from the sheriff's department at the door and tipped off Tom.
Tom leaves Wendy to deal with Las Vegas investigators by herself.
I let them in. They sat in the front room, and we're looking for Al Bramlett. "Do you know where he's at?" And I said, "No, I don't. I'm at home here with my baby." And they said, "Do you know what in the hell you're living with?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Your husband is a killer." It was the detective that came over earlier in the day that told Tom what was going on. That moment, I didn't trust anyone. I couldn't trust the cops. I couldn't trust Tom. Who was I to trust?
If police know about the thing that he's doing, and even they don't try to stop him, what are they going to do for her? Just another example of how trapped she was in this whole nightmare.
Tom turned up at home, and I told him about all the police, and Tom just said, "Oh, he'll show up. He'll show up. Don't worry." And then we started getting calls from Benny Binion, calls from other union leaders. I mean, that's the first time I've ever seen the phone ring off the hook.
Over the next 2 weeks, the police question Tom multiple times, but he continues to deny any involvement.
I thought they were protecting Tom. They're surely not asking him where Al Bramlett is. That's what kind of mindset I was in. Tom again leaves the city and he goes to Arizona.
Tom's very worried. He told Wendy that she would have to leave the house and never come back.
He had me so brainwashed at that point. Do what Tom tells you to do. I loaded up a bunch of boxes and documents and stuff, and they went into storage.
When Tom returns, he tells Wendy to arrange a sitter for Amy. He is taking Wendy for a drive in the desert.
And he kept assuring me everything was going to be okay, but I better keep my mouth shut.
Tom has a stash of clothes and jewelry he wants to get rid of.
We had a little ranch out in Pahrump. And he dug a hole, and he said, "Always remember where this is." I said, "Okay." He dropped the jewelry in the hole.
Then Tom plants a tree to mark the location.
In my mind, I'm thinking, is this really Al's jewelry? All I wanted was for Al to be okay. We got back in the vehicle. He pulls along the side of one of the canyons, and he said, "Come follow me." He says, "Start digging a hole." And he pulled out the gun, and he had it at the back of my head. And he said, "Start digging." So I got on my hands and knees, and I was digging with my hands.
By this time, Wendy has seen too much, and she is a liability for Tom.
And he cocked the gun, and I thought he was going to kill me.
Tom Hanley is about to pull the trigger on his wife, Wendy Mazaris.
I started begging him, please, let me be with our daughter. She needs a mother. She needs a father. Please let me be with my daughter. And he let me up. And he let me get back up and walk to the truck. He turned to me and he said, you're probably right. Amy does need someone to be with her. And then we just started driving. All I could think to myself is the clothes that he had put in the hole smelled like Al Bramlett.
3 weeks after Al Bramlett disappears, hikers near Nevada's Potosi Mountain come across a gruesome sight.
The search for Al Bramlett has ended here in the desert just 2 weeks from the night he disappeared.
An autopsy shows he was executed with multiple gunshots to the head.
My heart sunk because I always in the back of my mind thought that Al was just going to show up, that maybe they had him tied up somewhere or something and everything was going to be okay, but it wasn't. He was gone.
After the news breaks, police pay another visit to Wendy.
They said, do you know who your husband is and what he does? And I said, he owns the air conditioning business. They said, no, he's one of the most prolific killers of all time. It was so shocking to hear that come out of homicide detectives' mouths. Was I in denial? Probably yes. Was I brainwashed? Yes. It was just a horrible, horrible life.
He was thought of to have killed an FBI agent, William Coulthard. He was thought to have bombed 2 restaurants, the Alpine Village and the Starboard Tack. The rationale was the Culinary Union wanted them in the union and they didn't want to unionize.
Tom has gotten away with murder before, but this time, a tipster gives police a break in the Al Bramlett murder case.
An informant came to them and said that he was there when Al Bramlett was killed and that he was with Tom and Granby Hanley, who actually did the killing.
The Hanleys were upset because a couple of bombs they had planted didn't go off at businesses in Las Vegas that Bramlett wanted blown up. So, according to the Hanleys, Bramlett didn't pay them for that, $10,000. So they go to shake down Al Bramlett.
Bramlett was kidnapped from the airport parking lot.
They go into the desert outside of Las Vegas. At some point, Tom says, hey, Al. Al turns around and he shoots him in the head. He ended up getting shot 6 times, including once in each ear. All his clothes were taken off of him. He was buried under a pile of rocks in the desert with his hand sticking up to wave goodbye to the world.
A warrant is put out for the father and son fugitives, and on April 29, 1977, Granby and Tom are arrested in Phoenix, Arizona.
It was a media frenzy, and it was a frenzy at the Hanley house as well.
It was astonishing news. It felt good, it really did, but it took a few days for it to sink in. Were they gonna let him go again? Was he locked up for good? Tom really did kill one of his best friends. He took him out and he killed him, just like he was gonna do to me.
Tom and Granby are flown from Phoenix to Las Vegas to be tried for murder. When they land, Tom gives a statement while in handcuffs.
I never had any animosity towards Al Bramlett. He was one of the best friends I ever had.
After Tom's arrest, a mobster friend convinces Wendy to tell him what she knows.
I went out to the little ranch in Pahrump and I pointed to the tree that Tom had dug and buried.
Underneath the tree, they find Al Bramlett's jewelry.
And then everything just went crazy. A helicopter came down, all kinds of police came from everywhere. We were pulled over, and the homicide detective said, "You're under arrest, baby." I did not realize that he was an informant and working undercover with the police. I'm thinking, I didn't kill anyone, I didn't do anything.
Wendy is charged with receiving stolen property and for murder.
When you're charged with such a substantial charge like that, your whole life flashes ahead of you. And then on one day, workers in the jail stopped the elevator, and then they pulled Tom in there in the elevator with me. And then he started telling me, "Don't you say anything, everything's gonna be all right." So he had connections all the way inside the jail too. There was never any escape because the environment that I lived in with Tom, all of his problems came on me. That's what happens when you live with somebody like that. You get blamed too. How do I get rid of this guy? He's still gonna haunt me. He still knows people. He's gonna hurt me one way or another. I went to court and the charge was reduced to accessory to murder. And eventually the charge was dropped. I still had to do a year probation, but I felt a tremendous relief when they knew I didn't have anything to do with it.
By early 1978, the trial creates a media circus, with Wendy trapped defending Tom for fear of reprisal.
Do you think that Tom can get a fair trial here in Las Vegas?
No, he can't.
Why is that?
Publicity.
Have you,
The publicity is destroying him.
On March 2nd, 1978, Tom and Granby plead guilty to the murder of Al Bramlett and the restaurant bombings. They are sentenced to life without parole.
He was found guilty, and just a big sigh of relief came over me again. If Tom would have walked out of that courtroom a free man, there would have been a lot of people dead. A lot of people.
In return for them giving information on the mob, Tom and Granby are placed into witness protection within the prison system.
I felt bad for our daughter, Amy. I was able to disassociate myself with him and stand back and see everything he put me through.
After the trial, Wendy moves to California and attends college to try and start a normal life. She is only 22 years old.
There is no depths to a man like Tom Hanley. Once you're in their world, it's very hard to escape. And it was for me. I had to learn the hard way.
Years after escaping Tom Hanley, Wendy finds the courage to tell her story. She publishes a book about her experience as a mob wife called Vegas Ragdoll. Today, Wendy has been happily married for 25 years. And unlike many men in her life, this one is special.
She definitely had guardian angels, probably one on each shoulder.
We're complete opposites, but he does love and he protects me. He's a true husband.
Wendy's a very loving, strong person with convictions that will carry to the end.
He accepts me for who I am. He's taught me how to trust a little bit more.
Yeah, she met me, and I guess I was like the savior of her life for real, because I'll never let anything happen to her.
He truly loves me, and I love him, And I searched and searched, and I finally found the right man, a good man.
It begins with a red glow bleeding across wet asphalt, a police cruiser idling at the edge of a two-lane road, the clock on the dashboard blinking past midnight, and a routine traffic stop that no one will remember until years later. Because in this moment, no one knows that this stretch of Ontario highway is quietly connected to a disappearance that has been poisoning a community since 2003. A cold case whispered in kitchens and courtrooms. A name spoken carefully as if the wrong tone might summon something back. The night of the disappearance was unremarkable, which is often how these stories begin. With normalcy so complete it becomes unsettling in hindsight. A late summer evening when the air was thick with insects and the streetlights hummed softly, when doors were left unlocked and neighbors waved without thinking, when the idea of a predator moving through the dark felt like something that belonged on the evening news, somewhere else. She left her apartment with a jacket draped loosely over her arm, a habit she'd picked up from her mother. Always bring a layer even when the weather says you don't need it. And she stepped into a parking lot still warm from the day's sun, carrying nothing that suggested she was about to vanish. By morning, the jacket would be found folded over a guardrail near the river, clean, almost deliberate, as if placed by someone who understood symbolism, and the absence would begin to echo. Ontario 2003 cold case, the headlines would later say, but on that first morning there were no headlines yet, only a phone that rang and rang, a voicemail box filling with silence, a supervisor calling to ask why she hadn't shown up for her shift, a mother driving the same route twice, then 3 times, then pulling over to search the gravel shoulder with bare hands. Police arrived with notebooks and neutral expressions, asking questions that felt too calm for the situation. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Did she have enemies? Did she ever mention being followed? And each answer seemed to drift away before it could land, because nothing fit. Nothing explained how a woman could evaporate between her car and her front door. The first officers on scene noted the jacket, the lack of a struggle, the absence of tire marks or broken glass, and they exchanged looks that carried more weight than their words. The kind of look that says this is going to be difficult. Within days, the community shifted into a different posture. Doors locked earlier, children walked to school in groups, conversations hushed when strangers passed, and the local paper ran a photo pulled from a family album. Smiling, cropped too close, accompanied by a plea for information and a phone number that would ring for years. Ontario 2003 cold case. The phrase didn't exist yet, but the shape of it was forming, solidifying with every fruitless search, every helicopter pass over the tree line, every dive team descending into murky water and coming back with nothing but silt. Detectives worked the case with urgency that bordered on desperation, retracing her steps, mapping the area, interviewing anyone who might have seen something, anything, a car idling too long, a voice raised in anger, a shadow where it shouldn't have been, but memory is unreliable even when time is short, and within weeks the details began to blur. Witnesses contradicted each other. Timelines refused to align, and the river kept its secrets. The case files grew thick, binders filling shelves, each page a fragment of a life interrupted, bank statements showing routine purchases, phone records ending abruptly, a calendar with plans that would never be kept, and yet the center remained hollow. No suspect emerged with enough gravity to hold the investigation in orbit. No forensic evidence pointed in a single direction, and slowly, painfully, the language shifted from active pursuit to ongoing investigation, from urgency to endurance. Years passed, measured not just in calendars but in the subtle ways the town adapted to the absence. The annual vigil that drew fewer people each time, the missing person posters fading from shop windows, the mother aging visibly between interviews. Her voice steady but thinner. The detectives reassigned, promoted, retired, leaving the file behind like an inheritance no one wanted. Ontario 2003 cold case. The words finally printed in black and white. A label that both acknowledged failure and promised persistence. A reminder that some questions refused to stay buried. The file was reopened more than once, each time sparked by something small. A tip that sounded confident. A confession that unraveled under scrutiny. A piece of technology that promised clarity. But each surge ended the same way, with more paperwork and fewer answers. DNA was tested and retested, fibers re-examined, timelines rebuilt with software that didn't exist when she disappeared, and still the story would not resolve. The absence hardened into something like folklore, a cautionary tale told to newcomers, A reminder that even safe places have blind spots. Behind the scenes, detectives argued quietly about what they might have missed, whether the jacket was a message or a coincidence, whether the lack of violence meant trust, whether the river was a red herring, and every theory carried the same fatal flaw. No proof, no body, no voice to confirm or deny. The case became a weight, not just on the family but on the department itself, a mark that followed them, resurfacing whenever another disappearance made the news, whenever someone asked about unsolved cases, whenever a young officer leafed through old files and felt the chill of unfinished work. And then, years later, on a night that looked like every other night, a patrol car rolled to a stop behind a vehicle drifting just over the speed limit, its taillight flickering, the officer inside already thinking about paperwork and the end of shift, unaware that history was idling a few feet ahead. The radio crackled, the siren chirped once, and the car pulled over obediently, tires crunching on gravel, an ordinary interaction unfolding under indifferent stars. The officer approached, flashlight cutting through the dark, noting the driver's hands, the smell inside the car, the way the driver avoided eye contact just a fraction too long, small things easily dismissed, except tonight they lingered. A name was taken, a license checked, a routine procedure that sent information through a system now far more powerful than it had been in 2003, databases layered with decades of data, patterns waiting patiently for the right input. As the minutes stretched, something surfaced, a hit, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to slow the officer's breath. A connection that shouldn't have existed. A thread linking this driver to a place, a time, a name that had been dormant but never forgotten. Ontario 2003 cold case. The phrase flashed silently between screens and synapses, and in that instant the past leaned forward, ready to speak, if someone was finally listening. The officer did not react the way movies teach you to react. There was no sharp intake of breath, no dramatic hand drifting toward a holster, only a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the way the night suddenly felt tighter, as if the air itself had leaned in to hear what the computer was about to say. The name on the screen was common enough, forgettable, the kind that blends into paperwork, but the system beneath it had memories, timestamps, locations, a faint echo of an address that matched a grid reference from a binder that hadn't been opened in years, and the officer felt that instinctive warning that arrives before logic has time to assemble itself. He returned to the driver with the same measured steps, the same neutral posture, asked a few more questions that sounded routine. Where are you headed tonight? Have you lived in the area long? Anything in the vehicle I should know about? And each answer came quickly, too quickly, rehearsed in a way that suggested practice rather than honesty. The driver smiled when appropriate, laughed at the right moments, but the laughter died too fast, like a switch flipped off, and the officer noted it without comment, filing it away alongside the database alert and the inexplicable sense that this stop had just become something else. Backup was requested under the guise of protocol, a casual call over the radio that didn't betray the shift in gravity, and while they waited the officer's flashlight swept the interior again, lingering on a scuffed floor mat, a coil of rope half hidden under the seat, a stain that might have been nothing and might have been everything, impossible to tell under the jaundiced light. When the second cruiser arrived, its headlights cutting a wider arc across the road, the driver's shoulders stiffened, just slightly, enough to confirm the officer's unease. They asked him to step out of the vehicle, a request phrased politely but edged with authority. And as he did, the night seemed to hold its breath, insects falling silent, the river somewhere beyond the trees continuing its slow, indifferent movement, a sound that had haunted search teams years earlier without revealing anything of substance. The pat-down revealed nothing illegal, nothing that would justify immediate arrest, and yet the name on the screen refused to fade, tugging at a memory that wasn't quite accessible yet, like a word on the tip of the tongue. At the station, a senior officer pulled the old file, dust puffing gently as the binder was opened, pages yellowed at the edges, handwriting fading but still legible, and there it was, buried in the early interviews, a mention so minor it had been overlooked the first time. A neighbor who remembered a man fitting this description loitering near the parking lot in 2003, asking directions, offering help no one had requested. His name written down and then lost among hundreds of others when nothing concrete followed. At the time, it had meant nothing, just another face in the background of a crowded investigation. But now it glowed faintly, recontextualized by time and technology. Detectives who had worked the case years ago were called. Some retired, some promoted, their voices crackling with disbelief as they were told what had surfaced, a routine traffic stop, a name resurfacing from the margins, and one by one they began to remember, the feeling they'd had back then that something was off, the frustration of having no leverage, no evidence strong enough to hold. Ontario 2003 cold case, the phrase felt heavier now, less abstract, as if it were shedding its status as a label and becoming a living thing again. The driver was kept for questioning on unrelated grounds, a procedural maneuver that bought time, and as he sat in the interview room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, he appeared calm, almost bored, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes steady, the posture of someone who believed himself untouchable. Detectives took turns, starting gently, circling the edges, asking about his life, his work, his movements over the years, letting the silence stretch when answers came too fast or too smooth, and gradually the cracks began to show. Not in what he said, but in what he avoided. When asked about 2003, about where he had lived, who he had known, the air in the room shifted, his jaw tightening imperceptibly, his gaze flicking to the corner for just a fraction of a second before returning to the detective's face. And in that flicker they saw it, recognition not of guilt necessarily, but of danger, the awareness that the past he'd carefully buried might be clawing its way back. He denied knowing the missing woman, denied being anywhere near the river, denied even remembering the neighborhood, but denial without detail is a fragile thing, easily tested, easily bent. They let him go that night, a decision that would later be questioned, criticized, dissected, but in that moment it was strategic, a calculated risk, because now they had something they hadn't had before, a direction, a name that connected 2 points in time, and they intended to follow it quietly, methodically, without alerting him to how close the net might be drawing. Surveillance began, subtle and patient. A car at the end of the street, a check-in with employers, neighbors, anyone who might have noticed something odd over the years, and what emerged was a portrait of a man who blended in by design, helpful, unremarkable, always on the periphery of events, never at the center. As the days passed, the file grew thicker again, this time with modern printouts, digital maps layered over hand-drawn sketches from the original investigation, phone records now cross-referenced with cell tower data that hadn't existed in 2003, financial transactions re-examined for patterns that only made sense in hindsight. Slowly, the gaps began to narrow, the timeline tightening, the randomness of the disappearance giving way to something that looked increasingly intentional. The jacket by the river, once thought to be symbolic or misleading, took on a new resonance when investigators discovered that the suspect had worked briefly in landscaping near that stretch of water years earlier, knew the access points, the currents, the places where sound carried and where it died. It was circumstantial, fragile, but when combined with witness recollections and newly recovered data, it began to form a lattice strong enough to support a theory, one that made people uncomfortable because of how ordinary it was. In the community, rumors began to stir again, subtle at first, a mention in the local paper that the cold case was under renewed review, a reporter asking careful questions, a mother declining interviews until there was something real to say, and with each whisper the old anxiety resurfaced, doors locking earlier once more, memories sharpened by the possibility that the story was not over after all. The idea that a routine traffic stop could crack open a mystery that had defined a generation felt almost cruel in its simplicity, as if the universe were mocking years of effort with a single, mundane gesture. Inside the station, detectives worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and the fragile hope that this time the path might actually lead somewhere solid, aware that cold cases have a way of flaring brightly before collapsing back into darkness, and yet unable to ignore the sensation that the past was finally aligning with the present, that the long silence was beginning to fracture. Outside, the river kept moving, unchanged, carrying with it the weight of everything it had seen and refused to reveal, while somewhere in the city a man went about his life, unaware of how closely he was being watched, or perhaps aware and pretending otherwise, a predator who had survived on the assumption that time itself was the safest hiding place. Surveillance has a rhythm of its own, slow and relentless, a discipline built on patience rather than action, and as the days stacked up the detectives learned the cadence of his life, the hours he left for work, the routes he favored, the places he paused without apparent reason. He shopped at the same grocery store every Thursday, always parking in the far corner of the lot. He lingered too long in aisles without selecting anything. He returned home at irregular hours that never quite aligned with overtime claims, and each detail, harmless on its own, began to hum with implication when placed against the silence of a woman who had never come home at all. They watched him meet friends at bars where the music was loud enough to swallow conversation, noticed how he positioned himself with his back to the wall, how his eyes tracked entrances and exits reflexively, habits formed not from paranoia but from long practice. He spoke easily, laughed readily, and yet there was a hollowness to it, a sense that he was performing rather than participating, as if life were a series of scenes he had learned to navigate without ever committing to them. The detectives wrote it all down, aware that intuition without evidence is just suspicion dressed up in confidence. Behind closed doors, the old file was dissected line by line, every witness statement reread with fresh eyes, every assumption challenged, and what had once looked like randomness began to reveal subtle consistencies. A neighbor who had reported hearing a car idling late at night now stood out when matched to the suspect's vehicle registration history. A convenience store receipt once dismissed as irrelevant gained significance when overlaid with new timestamp analysis, placing him within a mile of the apartment complex at the critical hour. Even the absence of evidence, the lack of forced entry, the clean disappearance, began to suggest not spontaneity but planning. The detectives knew better than to rush. Cold cases punish impatience, offering just enough encouragement to lure investigators into mistakes, and so they moved carefully, requesting warrants only when the chain of inference was strong enough to hold under scrutiny. When permission finally came to search his vehicle, it was done quietly, during hours he could not account for, technicians moving with gloved precision, photographing, bagging, cataloging, treating the car not as a means of transport but as a time capsule. They found nothing overtly incriminating, no trophies, no bloodstains, but absence has its own language, and the immaculate condition of the trunk, inconsistent with years of use, raised more questions than it answered. Digital forensics became the next frontier, old hard drives pulled from boxes in basements, obsolete phones resurrected with specialized equipment, fragments of data coaxed back into existence, and in that digital archaeology, they found patterns of obsession, searches conducted late at night years after the disappearance, keywords that circled the same themes again and again, rivers, decomposition, missing persons, news articles about the very case that had supposedly meant nothing to him. Each hit was a whisper rather than a shout, but together they formed a murmur that could no longer be ignored. When they brought him in again, this time under the weight of more focused questions, his demeanor shifted subtly, the practiced calm fraying at the edges. He asked why he was there, asked if he was being charged, asked if he should have a lawyer, the questions tumbling out in an order that betrayed anxiety. The detectives answered patiently, explaining nothing, letting the silence do the work, and in that silence he began to fill the space with words. Too many words, explanations layered over explanations, a verbal smokescreen that only highlighted the shape of what lay beneath. They confronted him with specifics, dates, times, locations, details that could not have been guessed, and watched as he recalibrated in real time, adjusting his story to accommodate each new fact. When asked about the jacket, he dismissed it as coincidence. When asked about the river, he laughed and said everyone knew that area. When asked why he had searched for the case online so often, he shrugged and claimed curiosity, a community tragedy that had stuck with him. The answers were plausible, almost convincing, but the effort required to maintain them was visible now. Sweat beating at his temples, fingers tapping in erratic rhythm against the table. Outside the interview room, the detectives compared notes, aware that they were approaching a threshold, the point at which a case either breaks open or collapses under its own weight. They needed something tangible, something that would anchor the narrative they were building, because without it the defense would dismantle their work piece by piece, framing coincidence as obsession, proximity as bad luck. Cold cases demand proof that can survive the erosion of time, evidence that speaks louder than memory ever could. It arrived not with drama but with a notification, a lab result returning from a reanalysis of material collected years earlier. A sample once deemed too degraded to be useful now yielding a partial profile thanks to advances in technology. The profile was incomplete, fragile, but when cross-referenced with genealogical databases it produced a cluster of relatives that narrowed the field to a handful of individuals, one of whom sat waiting in an interview room, his confidence already thinning. The room seemed to shrink as the implications settled in, as the past and present finally overlapped in a way that could not be explained away. When confronted with the science, with the cold precision of percentages and probabilities. His resistance stiffened, denial hardening into something brittle and sharp. He accused the detectives of harassment, of building a story where none existed, of dragging up old tragedies for the sake of headlines, and for a moment the anger felt real, a flash of something raw and uncontrolled. But anger is revealing, and in its wake came exhaustion, shoulders sagging, voice losing its edge, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the fear beneath. The detectives did not press for a confession. They knew better. Confessions extracted under pressure are notoriously unreliable, especially in cases this old, and so they let him sit with the weight of what had been laid out, the knowledge that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. When he was released again, the third time now, the city outside felt different, sharper, as if every streetlight were a witness, every passing car a reminder that the net was tightening whether he acknowledged it or not. Back at the station, the team worked through the night, drafting affidavits, preparing warrants, mapping out the next moves with the precision of a chess game where one wrong play could undo years of effort. The case was no longer dormant, no longer a ghost haunting filing cabinets. It was alive, volatile, and moving toward a confrontation that would test not just the strength of the evidence, but the endurance of everyone involved. And somewhere between the river that kept its secrets and the road where a traffic stop had set all this in motion, the truth was beginning to surface, reluctant, incomplete, but no longer content to remain buried. Pressure does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it settles in quietly, reshaping behavior from the inside out. And in the days that followed, the detectives watched that pressure work on him with a slow, deliberate cruelty. His routines began to fracture, departures delayed, returns rushed, the careful symmetry of his life disrupted by something he could not see but clearly felt. Surveillance teams noted the changes with professional detachment, understanding that stress reveals truths no interrogation ever could. He drove past familiar turns without noticing, stood in parking lots staring at nothing, checked his phone compulsively as if expecting it to betray him. At home, lights flicked on and off at odd hours, curtains drawn tight even during the day, the television glowing late into the night with the sound muted, news footage rolling silently across the screen. When reporters began sniffing around the old case again, filing access to information requests, calling former investigators, the community sensed the shift and responded the only way it knew how, with rumor and fear rising together. Ontario 2003 cold case. The phrase resurfaced online, in comment sections and message boards, speculation hardening into accusation, strangers dissecting a tragedy as if it were entertainment, unaware of how close the truth might actually be. Detectives kept their distance publicly, letting the noise build without confirming or denying anything, because public pressure can be both ally and enemy, and they needed him unsettled but not alerted. Quietly, they secured warrants for deeper searches, places connected to him in ways that had once seemed irrelevant, a storage unit rented under a variation of his name, a property he had briefly owned years earlier and sold at a loss, an isolated patch of land he had visited far more often than necessity would suggest. Each location was approached with methodical care, forensic teams moving slowly, knowing that a single overlooked detail could be the difference between resolution and another decade of unanswered questions. The storage unit yielded personal effects that told a fragmented story, tools meticulously cleaned, boxes labeled with dates that meant nothing until matched against his employment records, and in one corner, wrapped in plastic, an item that stopped everyone in the room cold. A piece of fabric whose color and we've echoed the jacket found by the river all those years ago. It was not definitive, not yet, but it was close enough to make the air feel heavy, close enough to justify the tightening of the case. Samples were taken, photographed, logged, sent to the lab with a chain of custody that would withstand the harshest scrutiny. Meanwhile, the genealogical DNA work continued, branches of a family tree expanding and collapsing as analysts ruled out distant cousins and narrowed their focus. The science was precise, indifferent to narrative, and when the probabilities converged, they did so with brutal clarity, placing him at the center of a statistical storm that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. The detectives felt the shift internally, the moment when uncertainty gives way to cautious confidence, when a case stops asking questions and starts offering answers, incomplete though they may be. They brought him in again, this time with an air that made the purpose unmistakable. He noticed it immediately, the changed posture, the thicker file on the table, the absence of small talk. The interview began not with accusation but with a recounting of his own history, places he had lived, jobs he had held, details drawn from public records and private surveillance alike, a reminder that the life he thought unremarkable had been mapped in fine detail. As each fact was laid out, his shoulders tightened, his breathing shallow, the performance harder to maintain. When the detectives introduced the fabric, sliding a photograph across the table rather than the item itself, his reaction was instantaneous, a flicker of recognition he could not suppress. He leaned back, arms crossing defensively, lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time he stopped talking altogether. Silence stretched, thick and oppressive, the kind that forces the mind to race to fill the void, and in that silence the detectives sensed the shift from denial to calculation, the internal debate over what could still be salvaged. They spoke of the river, of currents and access points, of how knowledge once thought common turned out to be specialized, of how familiarity can be a weapon. They did not accuse him directly, did not say her name, but the absence of it hung in the room like a presence, undeniable and accusing. When they finally did say it, quietly, without emphasis, he flinched as if struck, a physical response that no amount of legal coaching could fully disguise. Outside the room, preparations accelerated. Prosecutors were briefed, arguments rehearsed, weaknesses identified and reinforced. They knew the defense would attack the case as circumstantial, as a patchwork assembled decades too late, and so they worked to ensure that every piece supported the others, that the story told by the evidence was coherent, relentless, and resistant to doubt. Cold cases are fragile by nature, vulnerable to the erosion of memory and the skepticism of juries, and this one had to be airtight. When he was finally charged, the announcement came not with fanfare but with a terse statement, a few lines confirming an arrest in connection with the Ontario 2003 cold case. The words chosen carefully to avoid prejudicing proceedings. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Phones ringing off the hook, reporters descending, neighbors speaking in hushed tones about how they had never suspected him, how he had seemed so normal. For the family, the news landed differently, a collision of relief and grief, the hope of answers tempered by the knowledge that no outcome could restore what had been lost. As he was led away, his face expressionless, cameras flashing, the community watched a familiar figure transformed into something monstrous by context alone, a reminder of how easily danger can hide in plain sight. Yet even then, even with handcuffs clicking shut and charges filed, the case was not truly finished. Questions remained, details unresolved, the final shape of the truth still obscured by time and silence. And as the river continued its endless flow, carrying memories downstream, the shadow of that night in 2003 stretched forward, refusing to release its grip just yet. Courtrooms have a different kind of silence, one that presses down rather than stretches out, and when the proceedings began, that silence settled over the room like a held breath, every shuffle of paper amplified, every cough sounding like an intrusion. He sat at the defense table in a suit that did not quite fit, hands folded carefully, eyes forward, the picture of restraint, while behind him the weight of years crowded into the space, a community's unease distilled into wood, glass, and fluorescent light. Ontario 2003 cold case. The phrase appeared again in headlines, stripped of mystery and rebranded as a legal battle, yet for those inside the room it remained something far more visceral. The prosecution opened with facts rather than flourish, aware that spectacle would only invite skepticism, and laid out a timeline that moved with deliberate care from the night of the disappearance to the traffic stop that had reopened everything. Each point was anchored to a document, a witness, a piece of data that had survived the erosion of time, and as the narrative took shape, it became clear that what once felt like an inexplicable vanishing now had contours, edges sharp enough to cut. The defense listened impassively, taking notes, already preparing to challenge not the events themselves but the connections drawn between them. Witnesses followed, some familiar faces aged by the years, others new, their testimony delivered with the careful precision of people who understood the stakes. A former neighbor described the late-night idling car, the uneasy feeling she dismissed at the time, her voice trembling as she admitted she still wondered if she could have done more. A forensic analyst explained how advances in technology had breathed new life into old evidence, translating microscopic traces into probabilities that carried enormous weight. And the jury leaned forward, grappling with science that felt both abstract and decisive. When the fabric from the storage unit was introduced, the room shifted, the air thickening as if everyone sensed the significance even before it was fully explained. The expert spoke calmly about fibers, dyes, manufacturing patterns, how they aligned with the jacket found by the river, careful to acknowledge limitations, to avoid absolutes, but the implication was unmistakable. The defense pounced on those limitations, cross-examining with vigor, highlighting every uncertainty, every gap, framing the evidence as suggestive rather than conclusive, and for a moment the balance seemed to wobble. Throughout it all, he remained composed, rarely reacting, his stillness a deliberate strategy, but there were moments when the mask slipped, when a photograph appeared on the screen, when a date was spoken aloud, when a witness used the word river, and in those moments his jaw tightened, his foot tapped, his eyes flicked away, small betrayals that the jury could not unsee once noticed. Body language, the defense would later argue, proves nothing, but humans are storytellers by nature, and they read meaning into everything. The family's testimony came last, and it was the most restrained of all. A decision made in consultation with prosecutors who knew that raw emotion can be a double-edged sword. Her mother spoke of routines, of phone calls that went unanswered, of birthdays marked by absence rather than celebration. Her voice steady but thin, and the room seemed to contract around her words. There was no accusation in her tone, no demand for vengeance, only a quiet insistence on memory, on the fact that a life had been interrupted and that interruption deserved acknowledgement. As the trial unfolded, media coverage intensified, experts debating the strength of cold case prosecutions, commentators questioning whether justice delayed could ever truly be justice delivered. Some argued that the evidence was too circumstantial, that time had blurred the edges beyond repair. Others countered that technology had simply caught up to the truth, and in the middle of it all sat 12 jurors tasked with navigating a narrative that spanned decades. Ontario 2003 cold case, once a symbol of failure, had become a test of faith in systems designed to outlast individual memory. Closing arguments returned to the beginning, to the ordinariness of the night she vanished, to the idea that predators rely on routine as much as opportunity, that familiarity breeds not safety but complacency. The prosecution urged the jury to see the evidence not as isolated fragments but as a mosaic, each piece incomplete on its own but unmistakable when assembled. The defense urged caution, warning against the seductive power of a good story, reminding them that doubt, not certainty, is the cornerstone of justice. When the jury retired to deliberate, the waiting began anew, hours stretching into days, the courthouse steps crowded with cameras, the family retreating from the noise, detectives revisiting every decision they had made, every path they had chosen, knowing that the verdict would validate or dismantle years of work. In the jury room, discussions were intense, jurors replaying testimony, scrutinizing timelines, arguing over what constituted reasonable doubt in a case where time itself was the greatest adversary. The verdict, when it came, did not arrive with cheers or gasps, only a collective exhale that seemed to empty the room of air. Guilty. The word landed heavily, not as triumph but as finality, a period at the end of a sentence that had run on for far too long. He showed little reaction as it was read, a flicker of something crossing his face before it settled back into neutrality, while behind him the family held each other, tears flowing quietly, relief and sorrow indistinguishable in the moment. Sentencing would come later, appeals would be filed, debates would continue, but the cold case was no longer cold, no longer a question mark hanging over a community. And yet, as people filed out of the courtroom, as headlines declared closure, there was an undercurrent of unease, a recognition that resolution does not erase loss, that answers, however hard one, do not heal every wound. The river still flowed, the road still carried traffic, and the memory of that night in 2003 lingered, a reminder that justice, even when achieved, leaves echoes that never fully fade. The guilty verdict didn't end the story, it detonated it, because in cold cases the word guilty is never just a conclusion, it's a doorway, and the moment it was spoken, Everyone in that courtroom understood the same brutal truth at once. Conviction is not the same as answers, and closure is not the same as peace. The cameras outside caught the headline version. Ontario 2003 cold case closed. Routine traffic stop exposes killer. Community stunned. But inside the family carried a quieter weight, the kind that doesn't fit on a front page, the simple, unbearable question that had outlived every season, every holiday, every birthday candle blown out in a room that always felt one chair short. Where is she? Sentencing was scheduled weeks later. Time that felt both merciful and cruel. Merciful because it delayed the finality. Cruel because it extended the suspense like a wire pulled tight. In that gap, the accused sat in custody, no longer the ghost in the margins but the center of everything, and detectives returned to their binders with a different urgency now. Not the urgency of proving guilt, but of extracting the last pieces of a truth that had been locked away for 20+ years. Cold case teams know this phase well. The verdict comes, the adrenaline drops, and the emptiness rushes in, the realization that even with a conviction, the biggest horror can remain untouched. The absence of a body, the absence of a final moment, the absence of a place to put flowers without imagining them drifting away. They tried again, one more interview, one more chance, careful, controlled, no threats, no theatrics, just the steady pressure of inevitability. They offered him something prosecutors rarely admit exists, the possibility that cooperation could matter, not in the sense of freedom, but in the sense of being seen as something other than a monster who took and then hid. They framed it as a human decision, the kind a person makes when the world has already decided what they are. He listened without interrupting, eyes flat, hands still, the same practiced composure, but the room was different now because he had lost the thing he'd been guarding for years. Ambiguity. A cold case thrives on uncertainty. A conviction burns it away. He asked for a lawyer before he answered anything meaningful, a predictable move, and yet even that request carried a tremor because the power balance had shifted. Back in 2003, he'd been invisible. In 2026, he was a headline, a case study, a cautionary tale. And in the cold fluorescent light of that interview room, with the evidence already cemented in a jury's mind, he started to bargain in the only currency he had left: information. Not everything, not the full truth, but hints, pieces, a sentence that could be interpreted 10 ways. A vague reference to water that might have meant the river, might have meant a lake, might have meant nothing at all. A shrug when asked about the jacket, as if to say, "You're still thinking about that?" A half smile that made the detective's skin crawl, because it suggested he enjoyed watching them chase shadows. That half smile would become a photograph the media ran for days, cropped and zoomed and labeled with words like remorseless, ice-cold, predator, and the community ate it up because outrage is a kind of fuel, and everyone wanted to believe the monster looked like a monster. But monsters rarely cooperate with our expectations. In older interviews, friends described him as reliable, quiet, the guy who helped you move furniture, who held doors open, who remembered names. That's what hit the town hardest. The realization that the danger hadn't arrived from outside. It had lived among them, smiled at them, blended in so well that their memories now felt contaminated. The sentencing hearing brought the family back into a room they never wanted to enter again. And this time the air felt thicker, not with suspense but with consequence. The judge spoke in measured language, referencing factors and standards, but the family heard it as something else, like a metronome counting down to the moment when the system would stamp a number of years onto a loss that had no number. Victim impact statements were read. Some were raw, shaking, full of images of empty beds and unanswered calls. Others were controlled, surgical, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of seeing pain spill. Her mother's statement was the one that froze the room. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She spoke softly, describing how she kept a pair of shoes in a closet because she couldn't bear to donate them, how she sometimes heard footsteps in the hall and her body still jumped, still believed for one impossible second that the door might open and her daughter might walk in as if she'd just been out for groceries. Then she turned her gaze toward him and said the sentence that made even the court reporter pause. "You stole her future, but you don't get to steal her ending. Not closure, not comfort, an ending, place, a truth, a final page, because without that, every cold case closed headline was a lie the living told themselves to get through the day." The judge delivered the sentence, lengthy, severe, the kind meant to signal that society had drawn a line, that there would be no return. The cameras captured the judge's gavel, the defendant's stillness, the family holding hands. But the moment that mattered happened after, in the hallway, when detectives approached the mother and she asked the question she had asked for years, the question that had survived every press conference and every candlelit vigil. Did he say where she is? The detective didn't answer immediately, because there are answers that hurt more than silence. Finally, he said the truth. Not yet. Maybe never. And the mother nodded as if she had expected it, because hope, in these cases, is a muscle that gets tired. And then, just when the story threatened to settle, just when the town started to exhale, something else happened. The kind of twist that turns a solved case into a living nightmare again. A clerk in records flagged an old incident report from 2004, filed and forgotten, about a vehicle seen near a decommissioned quarry outside town, headlights cutting across the dark at 2 a.m., a resident calling it in because they'd heard metal scraping, like a trunk lid, like something heavy being dragged. At the time, it was dismissed. A teenager's prank, a late-night hookup, nothing worth resources when the case was already drowning in maybes. But now, with the conviction on paper, detectives looked at the report differently. They cross-referenced the date with his employment log. He had sick leave that night. They cross-referenced the vehicle description with his old registration records. It wasn't a perfect match. It was close enough to reopen the ache behind everyone's ribs. Search warrants followed. Not for evidence to convict, that was done, but for the thing families crave more than justice, recovery. They brought cadaver dogs to the quarry, the ground pocked and uneven, the air carrying that mineral smell of rock and damp. The dogs moved with certainty at first, then hesitation, then a sudden sharpness, a change in posture that made every handler stiffen. The dogs alerted near a patch of disturbed earth that didn't look disturbed anymore. Time smoothing it, grass reclaiming it, the land doing what land does when it's asked to hide. Digging began. Shovels, then machines, then careful hands. Dirt peeled back in layers like history being unwrapped. Hours passed. Nothing. Then something. A scrap of fabric. A button. A piece of plastic that might have been a trash bag, might have been a tarp. The team slowed down, moving like surgeons, every motion deliberate because in these moments, a mistake can destroy what little is left. The mother waited in her kitchen, phone in hand, staring at a mug of tea gone cold. Reporters waited at the perimeter, whispering into microphones, hungry for the image of closure. Detectives waited with their breath locked in their chests. And then the call came, not triumphant, not definitive, but enough to make the world tilt. The items recovered were consistent with the time period. Consistent with the missing woman. Not conclusive yet. Still pending analysis. Still a maybe. That was the cruelty of it. Even in the search for remains, cold cases continue to deal in uncertainty, continue to drip truth in reluctant drops. In custody, he heard about the search. Of course he did. Prison walls are not soundproof to headlines. When detectives tried him again, offering him one more chance to tell them what they needed, he didn't deny knowledge this time. He didn't confess either. He said a single sentence that felt like a knife sliding slowly into the room. You're digging in the wrong place. No elaboration. No map. No merci. Just that. A taunt. Or a truth. Or both. And suddenly the cold case closed story fractured again, because if they were digging in the wrong place, that meant he still controlled the ending, still held the last page hostage. The quarry became a spectacle. The town reliving the nightmare in real time. Strangers driving out just to watch the earth being opened. As if grief were a show and closure a prize. The family's pain became content again. Looped on news channels, debated in podcasts, turned into timelines and theories by people who had never seen her smile in real life. The detectives worked through it with clenched jaws, because they knew exactly what this was. The final cruelty of a killer who had survived for decades by making himself the center of attention while erasing someone else completely. And in the middle of all this, another thread surfaced, quieter, stranger. A letter that arrived at the station without a return address, addressed to the cold case unit in blocky handwriting, the kind that looks deliberately disguised. Inside was a photocopy of an old map of the region, creased and marked with a circle in red ink. No note, No explanation. Just the circle. Just a location. An abandoned service road near the river, miles from the guardrail where the jacket had been found. A place so ordinary you could drive past it 1,000 times and never notice, which is exactly what made it terrifying. Ontario 2003 cold case had been declared closed, but now it was opening again, like a wound that refuses to heal cleanly, and as detectives stared at that circled spot, they felt the old sensation crawl back up their spines, the sensation they had carried since the first morning she didn't answer her phone, that the truth was close, close enough to smell and still just out of reach, waiting in the dark for someone to step the wrong way. The circle on that map looked innocent in the way traps always do, a simple red ring drawn with a cheap pen, but in the cold case unit it hit like a siren because it didn't arrive through official channels, it didn't have a file number, it didn't come attached to a name anyone could lean on in court, it came from the dark itself, from someone who knew enough to point and not enough to step into the light. The detectives stared at it under buzzing fluorescent tubes, their coffee going untouched. The room suddenly crowded with the presence of that missing woman again. Not as a photograph, not as a headline, but as a question with teeth. The circled location was close to the river, but not the place everyone knew, not the scenic lookout, not the well-worn trail where search teams had trampled the ground in 2003 until their boots went numb. It was a forgotten service road, a thin strip of gravel buried behind brush, the kind of access point municipal workers use and the public never notices, a place where you can stop a vehicle without being seen from the main road, where sound dissipates into trees, where the river is near. Enough to hear but far enough to hide. The map's paper was old, photocopied from something that had likely sat in a drawer for years, creased as if folded and unfolded in hands that couldn't decide whether to commit to the act of sending it. They didn't announce the search. They didn't warn the media. They didn't tell the community. The last thing they needed was a circus at the edge of a potential burial site. Strangers with phones, drones buzzing overhead, grief turned into spectacle again. At dawn, unmarked vehicles rolled out, tires whispering over wet roads, the sky a flat gray lid pressing down on everything, and the detectives felt the same sick familiarity as they drove. That sensation of returning to the origin point of a nightmare, hoping this time the road would finally end somewhere solid. The service road was worse than it looked on the map, narrowed by years of neglect, branches clawing at the sides of the vehicles, mud thick enough to swallow a boot. They parked where the gravel gave out, stepped into the cold air, and for a moment nobody spoke. The river was close, a dull, constant rush through trees, indifferent, endless. Somewhere a crow called once, harsh, then silence again. The dogs came first, handlers guiding them gently, letting instinct do what logic can't, and the dogs moved with purpose at the start, noses down, tails stiff, then slowed, circling, recalibrating, as if the earth itself was confusing. The first alert came near a shallow depression that looked like nothing at all, just a sag in the ground where rainwater collected. But the dog's posture changed, sharp and unmistakable, a stillness that felt like accusation. The handlers confirmed it, the second dog echoing the reaction, and the team's movements tightened immediately, switching from walking to measuring, from scanning to documenting, each step placed carefully as if the wrong footprint could erase what time had spared. They began with probes, thin rods pushed into soil, listening for changes in resistance, smelling the tip when it came out, a ritual that looks almost primitive until you remember it's guided by science, by training, by experience soaked in tragedy. The probe found softer earth, and the detective holding it felt his stomach drop, because soft earth in a place like this doesn't happen by accident. They marked the spot with small flags, bright against the dead grass, and then came the slow work, the careful work, shovels at first, then trowels, hands gloved and steady, pulling back layers of dirt like turning pages that don't want to be read. Hours passed. The sky brightened and darkened again with passing clouds. The river kept speaking its steady language. And then, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet clink against metal, a sound so small it was almost nothing, except every person on that site heard it and froze. A piece of material, not bone, not something that could be confirmed instantly, but an object that didn't belong to the earth, something manufactured, something carried here. The forensic tech brushed dirt away and revealed a fragment of jewelry. Tarnished, delicate, a clasp bent as if it had been yanked. No name engraved. No immediate proof. But it hit the team like a punch because it was personal, intimate, the kind of item you don't drop and forget, the kind you lose only when something has gone terribly wrong. The detectives didn't celebrate. They didn't allow themselves that luxury. In cold cases, hope is dangerous because it can make you careless. They photographed it, bagged it, logged it, and the search continued, widening, deepening, the earth giving up its secrets in reluctant increments. More items surfaced, small, degraded, the kind of evidence time tries to dissolve, and each new piece tightened the knot in everyone's chest, because the pattern was beginning to form, and patterns are the last thing you want when you've spent decades begging for randomness. Back at the station, the letter and map were treated like a suspect of their own, handled with gloves, scanned at high resolution, checked for latent prints, fibers, anything that could tie it to a sender. The paper yielded almost nothing, as if whoever sent it understood exactly how to avoid leaving themselves behind, but there was a faint trace of a particular toner, a type used by older office machines, narrowing the field to a handful of locations, small businesses, municipal departments, places where people still print old maps because digital doesn't reach everywhere. It wasn't much. It was enough to start another hunt. In custody, he was informed that items had been recovered near the river. The message was delivered clinically, no emotion, no leverage offered, just a statement of fact designed to see what his face would do before his mouth could catch up. His eyes flickered. That was all. A flicker like a match struck in a dark room. The detective across from him saw it and felt the old rage rise, the urge to slam a hand on the table, to demand the ending back, but he held it down because that's what predators feed on: loss of control, emotional volatility, chaos. The detective spoke softly instead, letting the calm itself become pressure. "You said we're digging in the wrong place." A pause, a slow breath. Then the man smiled, small and thin, like a blade's edge. "People keep hearing what they want," he said. The detective waited. Silence. Long enough for the fluorescent hum to become unbearable. Finally, the man leaned back as if settling into comfort and added, "A circle on a map can mean anything." It was a taunt delivered like philosophy, the kind that makes your skin crawl because it suggests he enjoyed the game more than the outcome. The detective pushed again, not with anger, with inevitability. "She deserves to be found." The man's smile didn't change, but something behind it tightened, something quick and ugly. "Deserves," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's not how it works." And there it was, the core of it, the worldview that had powered the entire crime, the belief that other people are objects, that endings are possessions, that control is the only true currency. The detective left the room with his hands clenched so hard his knuckles ached, and outside, in the hallway, he forced himself to breathe, because the case was cracking open, but not cleanly, not mercifully, and every new detail threatened to turn into another decade of half-truths. The lab processed the jewelry fragment first, a meticulous examination under magnification, comparing it against photos from the missing woman's family albums, wedding pictures, holiday gatherings, zooming in on wrists and necklines, hunting for matches. Her mother was called in to view the images, not the object itself, to minimize contamination, and when she saw it, her hands went to her mouth as if to hold in a sound. She didn't say yes immediately. She stared. She swallowed. Then she whispered, "She wore something like that." And the word like hung there, sharp as a hook, because in this world, like is not proof, like is not closure, like is just another shadow. The excavation continued for days. Each day brought more questions. The depression in the ground widened into something that looked disturbingly intentional. Soil disturbed long ago and then disguised. The surface smoothed, vegetation replanted. Nature recruited as accomplice. But even as they dug, they found contradictions. Layers that didn't match, items that seemed placed rather than lost. A faint smell of accelerant in soil samples that suggested someone had tried to erase. Cold case logic kicked in like a reflex, staging. Misdirection. A killer who understood symbols, who knew the investigators' minds, who anticipated how they would interpret every move. The possibility hit the unit like ice water. What if the circled map wasn't a confession, but a performance? What if someone, whether the convicted man himself through an intermediary, or someone connected to him, had chosen this moment to pull investigators away from where the truth actually lay? What if they were being played, not in court anymore, but in the landscape, in the dirt, in the space where families pray for mercy? Then the second letter arrived. Came 2 days after the first excavation, delivered the same way, no return address, no identifiable stamp beyond a local postmark. Inside was a single sentence, printed, not handwritten, as if the sender had decided to remove even the personality of pen strokes from the act. Stop digging for her where you can be seen. That sentence detonated inside the detectives' heads because it did two things at once. It implied knowledge of their secrecy, and it implied observation, as if someone had been watching the search team from the trees, from a distance, from somewhere that could see without being seen. The immediate instinct was to lock everything down, to pull back, to protect the site, but the deeper instinct, the colder one, was to understand what the sentence really meant. Where you can be seen. The riverbank. The service road. The quarry. Places accessible, places a stranger could find. Places that could be turned into theater. So they looked at the map again, really looked, not just at the circled location but at what was near it, what the red ring had conveniently ignored. A drainage culvert under the main road, hidden in plain sight. An old maintenance hatch leading to storm infrastructure that ran toward the river like veins under the town. A stretch of land behind a closed factory, its fence broken, its back lot invisible from the highway. The kind of places that don't exist in people's minds until something terrible forces them to notice. The detective who had grown up in the area remembered something then. An old rumor from high school about kids exploring tunnels near the river. A place they called the Black Throat, because it swallowed sound and light. It had never been on official maps, just a local myth, a dare. But myths are often built on something real. He pulled up municipal archives, infrastructure diagrams, maintenance logs, and found it. A storm outflow system built decades ago, partially decommissioned, sections sealed, sections forgotten. The line ran close to the original guardrail where the jacket had been found, like a hidden artery beneath the first clue. And suddenly the story rearranged itself in a way that made everyone's stomachs drop. The jacket hadn't been left as a symbol. It had been left as a marker, a signpost, a redirection, something clean and deliberate placed above something dark and unreachable. That night, under cover of rain that made the roads shine and the city feel blurred, the team returned to the river area again, not to the guardrail everyone remembered, but to the underside of it, the place where concrete meets earth, where stormwater disappears. They brought lights, harnesses, gas monitors, protective gear, not because they expected theatrics, but because they expected the kind of danger that doesn't care about storylines, collapsed tunnels, toxic air, swift water. The entrance was half hidden by brush, a circular mouth of concrete stained by years, the Black Throat, just as the rumor said. The river's sound changed here, echoing differently, like it was speaking from inside the earth. One detective clipped his harness, took a breath that tasted like wet stone, and stepped in. The beam of his flashlight cut forward and vanished into darkness, swallowed immediately. Behind him, the others held the line, watching, listening, their bodies tense with a fear that felt ancient, the fear of going underground to meet something that has been waiting longer than you. The air was colder inside, damp, metallic. Water dripped steadily. Somewhere deeper, something skittered and disappeared. The detective moved forward, boots splashing shallow runoff. And with each step the world of headlines and courtrooms fell away until there was only this tunnel and the question that had haunted Ontario since 2003. And then, in the beam of light, he saw it. A smear of red paint on the wall, fresh enough to still shine wetly. A single line drawn like an arrow pointing deeper into the throat, and beneath it, scratched into concrete with something sharp, one word. Closer. Not a confession. Not an apology. A message. A continuation of the game. The word closer sat in the concrete like a pulse, carved shallow but deliberate, and the detective felt something primitive tighten behind his ribs. That old instinct that says you are walking toward a truth that does not want to be found. The tunnel swallowed sound in a way that made each breath feel loud, each step feel like a violation. And behind him the team's radio stayed silent by choice because static can mask a warning and echoes can turn a small mistake into a fatal one. Water filmed the floor, ankle-deep in places, black with runoff, and the flashlight beam jittered with every movement, catching glints of broken glass embedded in slime, catching rust streaks, catching the occasional pale flash of something that might have been bone and then resolving into a plastic bottle, a rat's skull, a chunk of driftwood softened by years. He moved forward anyway because that's what cold cases do to people. They turn rational adults into pilgrims, crawling into places they'd never enter for anything else. following the faintest signs like scripture. The red paint arrow guided him around a bend where the tunnel narrowed, the air thickening, more metallic now, a faint chemical tang that made his nose sting. He checked the gas monitor clipped to his chest. The numbers held steady, but steadiness didn't mean safety. It only meant the danger hadn't revealed itself yet. Drips fell from overhead in steady intervals, like a metronome counting down, and somewhere deeper, water roared with the muffled intensity of an animal breathing. Another mark appeared ahead, red paint again, smeared as if applied by a gloved hand in a hurry, the pigment bright and obscene against the gray. There was a strange intimacy to it, the feeling that someone had been here recently, close enough that their warmth might still be lingering in the damp air, and that thought made the detective's skin crawl. The message wasn't old. It wasn't from 2003. This was now. Someone was playing with them in real time, watching the headlines, watching the search teams, watching grief become public again, and deciding where to push. He signaled back with a hand gesture rather than words, and 2 more detectives followed into the throat, harness lines taut, their boots splashing softly. They moved as a single body, controlled, slow, because underground you don't run, you don't panic, you don't make sudden decisions that the tunnel can punish. The beam of 3 flashlights layered over each other, creating shifting shadows that made the walls look like they were moving. At a junction, the red paint split into 2 arrows, one leading toward a side pipe barely tall enough to crawl through, the other toward the main channel where the roar grew louder. The detectives paused, listening, and in that pause the tunnel offered its own answer. A faint, rhythmic tapping from the side pipe, like metal against metal, 3 beats, then a break, then 3 beats again. Someone was down there. Not a ghost, not a memory, person. Every muscle in the lead detective's body tightened. He raised a hand, stopped the others, and angled his flashlight into the side pipe. The darkness inside was thick, almost solid, but the beam caught something reflective far in, a small glint that flashed and disappeared, as if something had turned, as if an eye had blinked. He felt his throat go dry. The case wasn't just reopening. It was reaching out. "Police," he said, the first word spoken in minutes, and his voice sounded wrong in that space, too human, too fragile. The echo carried it forward, bending it, turning it into something other. "If you're in there, come out." The tapping stopped. Silence flooded back in, heavier than before. Then, from deep within the pipe, a sound, not a voice exactly, but a low exhale, like someone trying not to be heard, and the detective understood in a flash the meaning of the letter. Stop digging for her where you can be seen. This wasn't about burial sites. This was about spectacle versus secrecy. Above ground, they could be watched. Below ground, they could be trapped. He signaled again, and the team behind them shifted position, one detective guarding the main channel, another preparing a camera pole to extend into the pipe without sending a human body into it first. The pole slid forward slowly, its small lens blinking in the darkness, transmitting grainy footage back to a handheld monitor. For seconds there was nothing but wet concrete and drifting debris, then the camera turned slightly and the monitor caught it. A bundle wedged in a recess, wrapped in plastic, taped tight, the kind of package that makes every stomach in law enforcement drop because it could be drugs, could be a weapon, could be something worse, could be proof. They didn't touch it. They didn't reach for it. Evidence in a tunnel is evidence in a trap. Instead, they marked the coordinates, took still images, and pulled the camera back. The lead detective looked at his team and saw the same thought in their faces. This package wasn't left here by accident. It was left to be found, and if it was left to be found, then someone wanted a reaction. Above ground, the cold case unit had already begun tracing the letters, narrowing toner types, scanning camera footage from nearby post offices, hunting for a face that had been careful not to show itself. Now, down here, that face might be closer than any of them wanted to admit. The lead detective kept his flashlight fixed on the pipe's mouth, waiting for movement, because the worst possibility had entered the room. The convicted killer might not have acted alone. The man behind bars could taunt all he wanted, but he couldn't paint fresh arrows underground. He couldn't mail letters from a cell without help. He couldn't be watching them in the trees if he was locked behind concrete and steel. An accomplice, a witness, copycat, or someone who had kept a secret too long and had decided, finally, to speak, but only through riddles. They retreated carefully, not running, never running, because panic is how tunnels win. When they emerged into daylight, the air above ground felt painfully wide, the sky too open, as if the world was mocking the tightness of the throat beneath it. Rain had started to fall, fine and cold, turning the riverbank into slick mud. The perimeter team took one look at their faces and understood without a word. The scene shifted instantly from search to operation. Uniformed officers arrived. Tape went up. Floodlights were requested for the night. A specialized confined space team was called in, the kind trained for industrial rescue, the kind that knows how to go into places where oxygen is a privilege and exits are not guaranteed. And then the nightmare did what it always does. It leaked into the public. A drone flew over the riverbank at dusk, buzzing like an insect, hovering too low, too bold, and someone on the perimeter cursed as it veered away and vanished into the trees. Minutes later, a local news station posted a vague update. Police activity near river connected to 2003 case. Comment sections exploded. The word cold case trended locally. People drove out to see. Flashlights bobbed through the woods beyond the tape like fireflies. Officers pushed them back, voices sharp, hands raised, but curiosity is a disease and tragedies are magnets. Back at the station, the second letter and the map sat under forensic lights, while the third message, closer, was entered into the case log like a taunt from the earth itself. Analysts ran the scratch marks through databases, looking for tool patterns, anything that could match a blade found in the suspect's property, anything that could tie it to the convicted man or to someone else entirely. They checked prison call logs, visitor lists, mail correspondence, because if he had an outside conduit, it would be there, hidden in the banal. They listened to recorded calls with the kind of focus normally reserved for bomb disposal, ears tuned for coded phrases, for names spoken too casually, for the slip of a location disguised as nostalgia. And somewhere in that audio they found it. Not a confession, not a direct instruction. A phrase repeated 3 times across 3 different calls, spaced weeks apart, each time spoken as if it meant nothing. Black throat, he had said, laughing lightly, telling someone on the outside a story about kids exploring tunnels, about dares and myths, about how people invent monsters when they don't understand infrastructure. The person on the other end had laughed too. A laugh that sounded wrong, sharp at the edges. The detective listening felt nausea rise, because now the underground wasn't just a rumor. It was a shared joke, private reference, a signal. They pulled the identity of the call recipient. The name was not in the original file. It wasn't in the trial transcripts. It belonged to someone who had never been charged, never questioned, someone who had lived quietly near the river for years, working a job that gave them access to municipal equipment, municipal maps, municipal toner. Someone with no criminal record. Someone who, on paper, was invisible. A maintenance contractor. Person who knew tunnels. A person who could paint arrows in red and vanish back into daylight without being noticed. The detectives moved fast. Not with sirens, not with lights, because again, spectacle could kill this. They needed the person where they couldn't run, couldn't call someone, couldn't destroy evidence. They found them at their workplace just before closing. Hands greasy from machinery, face neutral, eyes tired. The detectives approached with calm professionalism, asked for a few minutes to talk, watched the person's pupils dilate just slightly, watched their throat swallow hard. It was subtle. It was enough. In the interview room, the maintenance contractor sat with shoulders rounded, the posture of someone who has spent years bending over pipes and drains rather than sitting under bright lights. They denied knowing anything at first, denied sending letters, denied ever going near the river at night. The detectives didn't argue. They slid the photocopied map onto the table. They slid the printout of the prison call log onto the table. They played a small clip of audio. The convicted man saying black throat like it was a joke. The maintenance contractor's face drained of color. They didn't confess. Not yet. Their lips parted, then closed again, as if fighting a decision. Their hands trembled once, then stilled. They stared at the map circle, at the red pen, at the word closer printed in a report photo, and their eyes filled with something that could have been fear, could have been shame, could have been grief, and when they finally spoke, their voice was barely above a whisper, like they were afraid the walls themselves might hear. "I didn't do it," they said, "but I know where he wanted you to look." The detectives leaned in, every sound in the room sharpening. The maintenance contractor swallowed again, and then, with the haunted calm of someone stepping off a cliff, they said the sentence that made the entire unit go still. "He told me there was a way to make her disappear twice. Twice. Once in 2003, and once again years later when the case started breathing." The detective asked the only question that mattered now, the question that had outlived courtrooms and headlines, the question that had turned an entire region into a place of locked doors and quiet dread. "Where?" The maintenance contractor hesitated, eyes darting to the corner as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Then they whispered a location, an outflow junction deeper than the Black Throat, a sealed segment known to crews as the Dead Vein. A place nobody enters because it's unstable, because it floods fast, because it's not worth the risk for routine work. A place, the contractor said, where something had been wedged years ago, something wrapped, something heavy, something that smelled wrong even through plastic, and they had been paid not to ask questions. The detective's chest tightened. Paid. So it wasn't just fear. It was transaction. They stood up immediately. No time for paperwork theater. No time for speeches. The confined space team was already staging near the river, floodlights casting harsh white across wet ground, rain turning everything reflective. The lead detective looked out at the river, at the trees, at the road where a jacket had been placed like a signpost, and he felt the story pulling them back underground one more time, deeper this time, toward a place designed to swallow not just bodies but certainty. As they suited up in harnesses and helmets, the rain thickened, drumming on plastic and metal, making the world sound like static. The tunnel mouth waited, black and patient. The detective clipped in, checked the gas monitor, tightened his gloves, and stepped toward the throat with the feeling that they were no longer hunting a crime scene from 2003. They were walking into a living crime in 2026, orchestrated by someone who understood that the worst way to torture a family isn't to take a life. It's to take the ending and then keep moving it. Forever. And as the first floodlight beam cut into the tunnel again, catching the red arrow like a wound on the wall, the detective saw something that hadn't been there before, something fresh, something impossible to dismiss as old graffiti. A new line of paint, dripping, pointing not deeper, but back toward the entrance, toward them, as if the tunnel itself had turned around. And beside that arrow, written in hurried strokes, was a message that made the detective's blood go cold. "You brought her to me." The sentence "you brought her to me" sat on the wall like a living thing, paint still wet enough to glisten under the floodlights, and for a moment nobody moved because the message wasn't just a taunt anymore. It was an accusation aimed straight at the instinct that had been driving them for years. Follow the clue, chase the thread, keep going. Because now the tunnel was telling them that the act of searching had been anticipated, manipulated, weaponized, and the lead detective felt the weight of every decision stacking up in his chest, the quiet terror of realizing that someone might be walking them into a place designed not to reveal the truth, but to control how the truth is revealed. Rain hammered the entrance behind them, turning the riverbank into a slick black mirror, and in the mouth of the Black Throat the air was colder, stale, metallic, the kind of air that makes you aware of your own lungs, of how easily breathing can become a privilege. The confined space team moved in with practiced discipline, gas monitors chirping softly as they calibrated, harness lines checked and rechecked, helmets secured, lights tested, because this wasn't an ordinary search anymore, it was an operation in hostile architecture. A place that could kill you with one bad step, one sudden rise of water, one pocket of bad air, one collapse in a forgotten seam of concrete. The maintenance contractor stood at the perimeter under an umbrella that trembled in the wind, face hollow, eyes fixed on the tunnel like it was an open grave. They had given a location, an outflow junction deeper than the main channel, a sealed segment cruise called the Dead Vein, unstable, unpredictable, a place where floodwater surges without warning, and they had said it with the flat voice of someone confessing to something they hadn't done but could never wash off. "He paid me," they had whispered, and that detail kept echoing because payment meant planning, and planning meant the convicted man's power extended beyond prison walls. Or at least it had once, through a person who knew how to move through the town's hidden arteries without being noticed. The detective stepped in again, deeper this time, beyond the bend where the first red arrows had appeared, beyond the junction where the tapping had lured them toward the side pipe, past the recess where the plastic-wrapped package waited like bait. They didn't touch the package. They marked it, documented it, and left it alone because the point now wasn't to grab what was easy, it was to get to what mattered, the ending the family had been denied, the body, the proof, the final page. Their flashlights cut through damp darkness, beams bouncing off slick walls, and the tunnel seemed to swallow light the way it swallowed sound, turning every bright circle into a small, fragile island surrounded by black. Water along the floor thickened the farther they went, runoff deepening into a moving sheet that tugged at boots. The roar of the river above shifted as they passed under it, a muffled thunder that felt like the town itself breathing. The lead detective kept one hand on the guide line, the other on his light, his mind split between forward motion and backward fear, because the message on the wall had planted something poisonous. The idea that the person controlling this wasn't in the past, wasn't in 2003, wasn't just a story sealed by a verdict, but someone present enough to paint wet warnings, someone who might be down here, close, listening. The dead vein entrance was not dramatic. It was worse. It was ordinary. A maintenance hatch embedded in the wall, a rusted metal panel bolted shut, half hidden by mineral staining, a place you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look for it, unless you had been told. The confined space team set up, tools clinking softly, a sound that made the lead detective's nerves spike because metal noise in a tunnel can travel in strange ways, can become footsteps to the wrong ears. They loosened bolts with slow, controlled movements, sprayed lubricant, worked the panel free with a pry bar that groaned against decades of rust. The first gap opened like a mouth, exhaling air that smelled different, older, heavier, a stagnant breath with a faint sweetness that made stomachs turn. The kind of smell that makes your brain try to protect you by calling it anything else. Monitor, someone murmured, and the gas readings held, barely, just enough to proceed, but not enough to relax. The lead detective looked at the opening and felt that old cold case sensation. You are stepping into a question that has been waiting. The maintenance contractor had said no one goes into the dead vein because it floods, because it's unstable, because it isn't worth the risk. But something had been worth the risk to someone, long ago, enough to carry something heavy in here and wedge it beyond reach, enough to pay someone to keep their mouth shut, enough to build an ending inside the earth. They sent the camera first, a small crawler with a light and a lens, feeding live footage back to a handheld monitor. The screen showed the interior like a black and white nightmare. Tight walls, pooled water, debris lodged like bones in a throat. The crawler rolled forward slowly, its wheels hissing softly, and the tunnel narrowed into a cramped channel where the ceiling dropped low, forcing the camera to angle downward. For seconds there was only darkness and wet concrete. Then the lens caught something unnatural. A straight edge, pale and smooth, partially submerged, lodged against the wall like a rib of something larger. The confined space technician zoomed in. The image sharpened. A plastic storage tote, the kind sold in big box stores, opaque with time, its lid sealed with tape that had darkened and bubbled, the corners scuffed as if dragged. The lead detective felt his throat tighten, because the tote's presence was a sentence in itself, a container built to organize life repurposed to erase it. The technician adjusted the camera angle, panning along the tote's side, and the lens caught a faint mark, not a label, not a barcode, but a smear of red paint, a thumbprint-sized streak that looked eerily like the arrows outside. The lead detective stared at the monitor, mind racing. If that tote had been placed here in 2003, it would be degraded, maybe broken, maybe swept away by floods. But it looked intact. Too intact. The tape, though old, looked more like years than decades. The red smear looked fresh enough to still be vivid. The idea hit him like a punch. Someone had been here more recently. Someone had touched the container. Someone had maintained it, or moved it, or staged it. You brought her to me, the wall had said. The tote felt like the punchline. They didn't have time to debate it. The confined space leader made the call. They would enter, secure the area, and extract the tote if possible without compromising safety. The lead detective clipped his harness tighter and crawled through the hatch, shoulders scraping damp metal, the dead vein swallowing him immediately. Inside, the air was thicker, muffled, the sound of the outside world fading until there was only dripping water and the soft hiss of his own breath in his mask. He moved forward on hands and knees, boots sliding in shallow water, light beam bouncing off narrow walls. Behind him, a second detective followed, then the technician, then the rescue specialist, each tethered to lines like divers descending into a wreck. The crawl was longer than it looked on camera. Every few feet, debris snagged at their clothing, strands of plastic, twisted wire, fragments of storm junk carried in by years of runoff. The lead detective's mind kept flashing between eras. The woman leaving her apartment in 2003 with a jacket over her arm, the guardrail by the river, the long years of silence, the traffic stop that resurrected the case, the verdict that declared it closed, the letters that reopened it again, the wet paint arrows that proved the case was still breathing. Time felt compressed down here, like the tunnel itself refused to acknowledge calendars. When they reached the tote, it was wedged in a shallow recess where the wall bowed slightly inward, protected from direct current, exactly where someone would place something if they wanted it to stay. The tape around the lid was thick, layered, wrapped with obsessive thoroughness. The lead detective leaned close, light beam grazing the plastic, and the smell hit him fully, sweet rot wrapped in damp concrete. The unmistakable scent of organic decay that makes your body recoil even if your mind tries to deny it. The second detective's breathing changed in the mask, a subtle hitch. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel like profanity. They photographed it. They documented the tape. They swabbed the red smear. They checked the recess around it for prints, for hair, for fibers, anything time might have spared, anything the killer might have left behind without meaning to. And then they began the extraction, slow, careful, because if this tote contained remains, any jostling could damage what little evidence existed, and if it contained something else, if it was a trap, rushing could kill them all. The rescue specialist anchored a strap around the tote, tightening it gently, and the lead detective braced his shoulder against the wall to help free it. The plastic resisted at first, suctioned by mud, held by years of sediment like the earth didn't want to let go. They pulled in unison, muscles straining, water sloshing. The tote shifted an inch, then another, making a wet sucking sound that felt obscene. As it came free, a cloud of black silt bloomed around it, thickening the water, turning visibility into nothing. The lead detective blinked hard, tasting metal, focusing on the strap line, because in a silt-out environment, panic is instant death. The tote finally slid into the channel, and at that exact moment something changed. A vibration ran through the dead vein, subtle but unmistakable, like distant thunder under concrete. The gas monitor chirped once, not an alarm, just a note, and then the sound of water shifted, deepened, began to rise in pitch. The rescue specialist froze, eyes widening behind the face shield. The lead detective felt cold flood into his stomach, because every confined space briefing says the same thing. Storm systems can surge without warning, and in a dead vein there is nowhere to run. Back! The specialist mouthed, voice muffled. Now! They began moving, dragging the tote with the strap line, crawling fast but controlled, not sprinting, because you can't sprint in a tunnel, you can only hurry toward your own fear. Behind them, the water sound grew louder, the dull roar becoming a rushing hiss, and the lead detective glanced back and saw the water level changing, not slowly, but with a suddenness that made his skin crawl. A surge was coming through the system, driven by rain above or something else. Someone opening a gate, someone triggering a release, someone deciding this was the moment to wash the truth away again. The confined space leader's radio crackled faintly, distorted by concrete. Flow spike! A voice warned from outside. Move, move! They crawled. The tunnel seemed longer now, walls closing in, air thick. The tote bumped along the floor, snagging on debris, slowing them, and the lead detective felt the terrible calculus of rescue. Do you save the evidence or do you save the people? He shoved the thought down because if they didn't get out, none of it mattered. The water behind them surged faster, pushing a cold wave forward that slapped against their boots, then their knees. The sound became violent, a living thing charging down the channel. Then the light ahead flickered. For a split second, the lead detective thought it was his own headlamp failing. But the flicker wasn't internal. It was ahead of them, deeper in the hatch direction, a brief interruption as if someone had passed in front of light outside, as if a shadow had moved across the entrance. His heart hammered. Someone was at the hatch. Someone was watching. Someone could close it. Someone could seal them in and let the dead vein do what it was built to do, carry everything away. They lunged forward, adrenaline turning their muscles into wire. The tote scraped hard against concrete. The second detective cursed through his mask. The water rose to mid-thigh now, dragging at them, threatening to pin the tote in a new place, threatening to jam their bodies. The lead detective reached the hatch and slammed his shoulder up, climbing out with a desperate force that tore skin. He emerged into the main channel like a diver breaking the surface, gulping air that tasted like rust and relief. Outside the hatch, floodlights flared, rain blurring their halos, and for one heartbeat everything was chaos. Hands grabbing harness lines, shouting muffled by masks, water roaring in the tunnel behind them. The tote was hauled out last, heaving and heavy, dripping black water onto the concrete floor. Officers dragged it back from the hatch, away from the surge, toward a sealed evidence tent erected at the entrance. And then the lead detective saw it, the detail that turned relief into a new kind of terror. On the inside edge of the hatch, freshly smeared in red paint, was a fingerprint trail, 5 distinct streaks, as if someone had just touched it, steadying themselves, pulling away. Someone had been there seconds ago. Someone had nearly closed them in. And as the rain hammered down and the river roared beyond the trees, the detective realized with a cold, sinking clarity that the killer's control hadn't ended with a conviction. It had only changed shape, and now the town wasn't just haunted by a crime from 2003. It was being hunted by an active hand in 2026, an unseen accomplice still moving in the dark, still deciding when and how the truth would surface. They pulled the tote into the evidence tent. Zippers closed. Cameras were shut out. For the first time in decades, they were inches from the ending the family had begged for. The lead detective stood there, water dripping from his sleeves, hands shaking slightly despite training, and he listened as the forensic tech prepared the cutter, the careful blade that would slice through tape without damaging what lay beneath. The tent's plastic walls snapped in the wind. The floodlights outside hissed with rain. The room smelled like wet concrete and something worse. The blade found the tape. The first cut peeled back a strip with a soft tearing sound that felt louder than it should have. And from somewhere beyond the tent, beyond the taped perimeter, beyond the floodlights, a voice spoke from the darkness, calm, close, unmistakably human. "Don't open that." Not shouted, not whispered, said like an instruction. Said like someone who had been waiting for this exact second. The voice didn't come from a megaphone, didn't come from a distance, didn't echo like a shout across the riverbank. It came from close enough that every hair on the lead detective's arms rose at once, close enough that the words seemed to slip through the seams of the evidence tent itself, as if the darkness had learned how to speak. "Don't open that." Calm, flat, certain, not a plea, not a warning. A command delivered with the casual authority of someone who believes they still own the ending. Inside the tent, the forensic tech froze with the cutter midair, the blade hovering above the last strip of tape, and for half a second the entire world held still. Rain hammering plastic, floodlights hissing, the river roaring beyond the trees, because everyone understood the same thing at once. Whoever painted arrows in the tunnel, whoever mailed letters, whoever touched that hatch seconds before it could close was here, now, within breathing distance. And if they were here, it meant the case had never truly been contained. It had been living alongside them, moving when they moved, watching when they watched, adapting like a predator that refuses to starve. The lead detective stepped out of the tent so fast the zipper slapped behind him. The air hit his face like cold metal. Floodlights carved the riverbank into harsh white shapes. Tape lines, muddy footprints, officers clustered in rain gear, the mouth of the black throat swallowing light. Beyond the perimeter, trees leaned and shuddered in wind. The voice had come from the dark side of the lights, the place where shadows begin, where everything becomes suggestion. He lifted a hand, signaled silence, and the perimeter officers stopped moving, hands hovering near radios, near belts, near the edges of panic. "Who is that?" the detective called, keeping his voice level. "Show yourself." No answer, only rain. Then a soft sound, the wet crunch of a foot shifting in mud. A silhouette moved between trees, barely visible, a person-shaped void where light failed. The detective's flashlight snapped toward it, beam slicing through rain, and for a fraction of a second it caught a face. Hood up, features blurred by water and motion, eyes reflective with something that looked disturbingly like amusement. Then the figure turned and ran. "Go!" the detective barked, and the perimeter broke into motion like a released spring. The chase was ugly, not cinematic, not clean. Men and women in boots slipping on wet ground, flashlights bobbing wildly, radios crackling with shouted coordinates, the riverbank swallowing sound. The figure moved with familiarity, cutting through brush at angles that suggested they knew exactly where the hidden gaps were, where the fence sagged, where the ground dipped into a drainage ditch that could break an ankle if you hit it wrong. They didn't run like someone escaping for the first time. They ran like someone who had rehearsed. The lead detective followed, breath burning, knees pumping through mud. Ahead, the figure vaulted a fallen log and disappeared down a slope toward the service road, the forgotten access point marked by that first red circle. Officers converged from both sides, trying to cut them off, but the figure veered toward the culvert under the main road. Exactly the kind of place someone would run to if they understood the town's veins. The detective's stomach tightened. Underground again. Always underground. "Don't let them go into the culvert," someone shouted. But the figure was already there, slipping into the dark mouth of concrete like it was home. The lead detective reached the entrance as a gust of wind slapped rain into his eyes. The culvert was narrower than the Black Throat, lower, a brutal crawl space carrying stormwater toward the river, and the water inside was higher now, surging with the storm. The figure disappeared into it anyway. A sane person wouldn't. A person with a plan would. "Hold," the detective snapped, forcing his team to stop at the edge. "No hero runs. Lights. Monitor." A confined space rescue specialist arrived, panting, gas monitor raised, scanning the air at the culvert mouth. The readings were unstable, not lethal, but risky. The water was moving fast enough to drag someone under if they lost footing. And the figure inside could be armed. Or desperate. Or both. The lead detective's mind flashed to the dead vein surge, the hatch smeared with fresh red paint, the sense of being herded, and he understood the trap shaping itself. Chase them underground, lose control, lose the evidence, lose people. So he did the hardest thing a detective ever has to do. He stopped chasing the shadow and turned back toward the truth. "Contain the culvert," he ordered, voice sharp. "Set eyes. Thermal if we have it. Call K9. Nobody goes in blind. I'm going back." He ran back toward the tent, boots slipping, heart hammering with rage and urgency, because while officers pinned down the living threat, the ending was still zipped inside plastic walls, waiting. The voice had tried to stop them from opening the tote. That alone was a confession. You don't command someone not to open a box unless you know what's in it. Unless the box contains something you've been guarding like a secret altar. Inside the evidence tent, the forensic tech's hands were steady again. Steadier than the lead detective's. The tote sat on a metal table, dripping black water onto absorbent pads. The tape around it looked grotesque up close, layered and warped, wrapped with a meticulousness that felt intimate. The red smear swab had already been sealed in a vial. The cutter hovered at the final seam. The detective nodded once, a silent permission. The blade slid under the tape and lifted. A soft tearing sound, like skin peeling away from adhesive. The lid resisted for a heartbeat, suctioned by damp and time, then gave with a faint pop that made every person in the tent flinch. The smell hit instantly, a heavy sweetness that clawed up the throat, an odor so unmistakable the body reacts before the mind can process. The forensic tech didn't gag. They simply leaned in, eyes focused, gloved hands moving with slow, reverent precision, because whatever lay inside was no longer evidence in the abstract. It was someone. Inside the tote was another layer. Plastic sheeting folded tight, tied at the corners, taped again. The tech cut carefully, lifting the plastic away as if unwrapping something sacred and horrific at the same time. The lead detective's chest felt like it might crack open. Outside the tent, radios crackled faintly with updates about the fleeing figure, but inside, the world narrowed to the tote and the truth inside it. The plastic opened. What emerged was not clean, not cinematic. Time had done what time does, eroded, altered, transformed flesh into a different kind of silence. The remains were partial, disturbed by water and sediment, but human, unmistakably human, bones and fragments wrapped in the last stubborn clings of cloth. A piece of fabric with a pattern the lead detective recognized from photographs in the file. A shirt she'd worn in a family gathering years ago. The kind of detail that makes grief physical. The forensic tech's voice stayed professional as they began cataloging, but it trembled slightly when they said the words the family had been waiting decades to hear. We have remains. Outside, the storm didn't stop. The river didn't pause. But in that tent, for the first time since 2003, the missing woman was no longer only a name, no longer only a picture, no longer only a cold case label. She was present in a way that broke everyone's hearts at once. The lead detective stepped out of the tent and felt the rain hit his face like absolution and punishment combined. He raised his radio. "Notify the family," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word before he forced it steady again. "We have remains." There was a pause on the line, a small silence that carried 2 decades of pain. Then a simple, "Copy," and the channel filled again with operational chatter, because even in moments like this, the machine keeps turning. But the living threat wasn't done. Thermal picked up movement, an officer's voice said through static. "East of Culvert, heading toward maintenance yard." The maintenance yard. The words snapped into place like a lock turning. Municipal equipment, old printers, toner, maps, access. The maintenance contractor had been questioned, had whispered about payment, had pointed to the dead vein. But what if the contractor wasn't the only one? What if the contractor was the crack in a larger structure? The lead detective felt a sick certainty settle. Whoever ran from the riverbank was heading toward tools, toward access, toward the place where you could hide in plain sight by wearing a uniform and carrying a clipboard. He sprinted again, following the direction of officers' lights, rain blurring everything into streaks. The maintenance yard sat behind a chain-link fence topped with bent wire, its gate half open as if someone had left in a hurry. Floodlights inside the yard cast long, sharp shadows over parked trucks, excavators, stacks of pipe, coils of hose. Perfect maze. Perfect place to vanish. Officers spread out, weapons drawn but controlled, voices low. "Police!" someone called. "Come out." A movement flashed between 2 trucks. The figure darted deeper. An officer slipped, cursed, regained footing. The lead detective's flashlight swept across wet metal and caught something bright. Red paint on a glove, smeared and fresh. The figure's hood dropped for a second, and the lead detective saw the face clearly now. It was the maintenance contractor. Not the exhausted, rounded posture from the interview room. Not the quiet, fearful worker under fluorescent lights. This was a different face. Jaw tight, eyes hard, adrenaline sharpening features into something almost unfamiliar. They had lied by omission, and now the lie was sprinting through rain. "Stop!" the detective shouted, and the contractor turned their head just enough to shout back, voice raw now, stripped of calm. "I tried to stop it." They ran again, zigzagging between equipment, heading toward a small building at the back of the yard. A storage office, window dark, door ajar. The lead detective felt dread spike. Doors ajar in storms are never accidental. They are invitations, or escape routes. The contractor slammed inside. Officers surged forward, boots pounding. The detective reached the threshold and smelled something sharp, solvent, paint, chemical. Inside, the office was dim, lit only by a computer monitor glow and a flickering overhead light. Papers scattered across a desk. A photocopier in the corner. Red paint cans open, brushes wet. Maps, multiple maps, and taped to the wall like a shrine. A timeline of the case, photos of the missing woman, screenshots of headlines, court dates. The phrase "cold case closed" circled in angry marker. The contractor stood in the middle of it, chest heaving, hands raised halfway as if unsure whether to surrender or fight. Their eyes were glassy with panic and something else. Shame, grief, obsession, maybe all of it braided together. You mailed the letters, the detective said, voice low, deadly calm. You painted the arrows. You touched that hatch. The contractor shook their head hard, rain dripping from their hair onto the floor. I didn't kill her, they said again, louder, desperate. He told me where she was. He told me if I didn't help, he'd tell them I did it. He said he'd ruin me. He said. Their voice cracked, and they swallowed hard, eyes darting to the photos on the wall as if they couldn't bear to look at her face too long. He said she was already gone. He said the only thing left was control. The lead detective felt the truth shifting again, expanding, becoming uglier. A killer behind bars still pulling strings. A contractor trapped by fear and greed and secrets. A case that didn't end with a body because bodies can be moved, hidden, staged, used as bargaining chips across decades. And the surge? The detective pressed. The water in the dead vein. That was you too. The contractor's mouth opened, then closed. Their eyes filled with tears that looked almost like rage. I didn't know you were in there, they whispered. I didn't. They stopped because the lie was too thin now. The room smelled like paint and wet paper and something rotten that wasn't physical, something moral. The detective stepped closer, just a step, slow, keeping the space controlled. You told someone, he said. You told him we were there. You tried to stop us from opening the tote. The contractor's shoulders sagged, collapsing inward as if the fight had drained out. He called. They said, voice shaking. From inside. He said if you opened it, you'd finally stop listening to him. He said the case would end without him. He said. They laughed once, a broken, ugly sound. He said he needed the ending to belong to him. Outside, thunder rolled far away. Inside, officers tightened their grip. Ready. The contractor looked up suddenly, eyes wide with a new kind of fear, and the lead detective saw it instantly. There was something else. Something they hadn't said yet. Something heavier than letters and paint. What did you move? The detective asked, soft. The contractor blinked rapidly, tears mixing with rain. Not all of her, they whispered. The words hit the room like a gunshot. The lead detective's blood went cold. Where is the rest? The contractor's gaze dropped to the floor, then slid sideways to a metal locker in the corner of the office, dented, streaked with rust. Their lips trembled. He made me, they said, barely audible. He made me keep proof. The detective nodded once to an officer. The officer moved to the locker, hand on the latch, and for a single suspended moment the room became a breath held at the edge of a cliff, because if the locker held what the contractor implied, the case wasn't closing tonight. It was splitting open into something even darker. The latch clicked. The locker door began to swing open. And outside, in the maintenance yard, a radio burst to life with a voice that didn't belong to any officer on scene. A voice distorted but unmistakably calm, sliding through static like a knife. You should have stayed out of the tunnels. The locker door didn't swing open like a reveal in a courtroom drama. It creaked, slow and stubborn, metal complaining under an officer's gloved hand. And the sound scraped across everyone's nerves because the room already felt infected by the idea that the case could still be rearranged by someone's will. The contractor stood frozen beside the desk, eyes locked on the locker as if they were watching their own life split in half, and the lead detective felt his stomach tighten in a way he hadn't felt even in the dead vein. Because underground you fear collapse and water and air, but in a small office lit by flickering fluorescent, you fear choices, you fear what people do when they think nobody is watching. Outside, the radio hissed again, that calm, distorted voice sliding through static like a fingertip across glass. You should have stayed out of the tunnels. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was almost satisfied, like the speaker was enjoying the timing, enjoying the way the words landed exactly as the locker opened, as if they had a camera on the room, as if they were standing just behind everyone's blind spots. The lead detective didn't flinch. He forced his face into stillness and raised his radio slowly. Unit to dispatch, he said, voice measured. We have an unknown transmission on our channel. Patch comms. Lock down frequencies. Trace if possible. He knew what he was asking for was nearly impossible in the moment. Storms mess with signals, Cheap transmitters can hop bands, scanners pick up anything, but saying it out loud did something important. It reminded everyone, including whoever was listening, that the police were not prey. Not tonight. Not anymore. The locker interior was darker than expected, stuffed with plastic bags, a red paint-stained rag, a few rolled maps held with rubber bands, and then, wrapped in a towel, a small box, the kind you'd find in the back of a jewelry store drawer. The officer lifted it carefully, placed it on the desk, and opened it with the slow precision of someone defusing a bomb, because sometimes evidence is a bomb, not physically but emotionally, the kind that detonates inside families. Inside were personal items, not trophies displayed for admiration, not staged for theatrical horror, just objects that had once been part of an ordinary life. An earring with a broken clasp, a thin chain necklace, a key fob worn smooth, and a ring with a tiny scratch on the band, the kind that happens when you catch it on a doorframe. The lead detective's throat tightened because he'd seen that scratch before in a photo from the file, blown up and pixelated, a family snapshot where the missing woman held a mug and laughed, her hand half visible, the ring catching sunlight. The contractor made a sound that wasn't a sob and wasn't a laugh, something strangled in the middle, and they covered their mouth as if to keep the sound from escaping the room. He said I needed leverage, they whispered, voice trembling. He said if anyone doubted me, I'd have proof. He said it was insurance. Insurance for who? The detective asked, quiet. The contractor's eyes filled, glossy with panic. For him, they said. Always for him. Outside, an officer burst into the office doorway, rain dripping off their cap, breath sharp. We found a small transmitter, they said, voice low but urgent. In the yard, under a stack of pipe.
Battery-powered.
It's been rebroadcasting on our frequency. So the voice wasn't magic. Not a phantom in the radio system. It had been local, nearby. Someone had planted it to taunt them at the precise moment. A voice that wanted presence without risk, intimacy without capture. The lead detective felt the rage flare again, hot and clean, and then settle into something colder, because now the shape of the truth was unmistakable. The convicted killer wasn't the only one who had craved control. Someone else had learned to crave it too. They secured the transmitter like a weapon. They took fingerprints, DNA swabs. They bagged it, labeled it, the ritual of procedure wrapping itself around a moment that still felt unreal. The storm outside howled, and the floodlights made every raindrop look like falling glass. The contractor slumped into the chair as if their bones had turned to water. It wasn't supposed to go this far, they whispered, staring at the box on the desk like it was cursed. He contacted me years ago, before the arrest, before the trial. He knew I worked maintenance. He knew I had access. He said the river hides things better than people think. He said he'd tell me where she was, and I'd finally stop wondering. He said I could make it right. Make what right? The detective asked, and his voice stayed calm, but his hands were clenched so tight the tendons stood out. The contractor's eyes darted up, then down. My own guilt, they said, because I saw him back then, in 2003, near the river. He asked me for directions to the service road. I gave them. I didn't think. I didn't know. But after she vanished, I remembered his face. And I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure. Because I was scared of being wrong. Because I wanted the fear to be someone else's problem. The detective felt the room tilt slightly, not from surprise, but from the sick familiarity of that confession. That's how cold cases survive, not just through the cunning of predators, but through ordinary human hesitation, the moment someone chooses silence because certainty is uncomfortable. And the tote, the detective said. The dead vein. The contractor nodded slowly, tears sliding down without sound. He told me where it was, they whispered. He told me it had been moved once, not by water, by him. He said when people started asking questions again, he needed it somewhere safer, somewhere it wouldn't surface on its own. They swallowed hard. He paid me to open the hatch, to push it deeper, to seal it. Years ago, the detective said. Yes, the contractor breathed. Years ago. And the surge, the detective pressed, voice sharpening. You didn't know we were inside? The contractor flinched. "I knew you were going down," they whispered. "I didn't think you'd go into the dead vein in a storm. I thought you'd mark it and leave." He called and told me to open the overflow gate just a little. He said it would wash your tracks, wash your greed away. He said it would remind you the tunnels don't belong to you. The detective stared at them, and for a moment he saw something almost pitiable there. Someone who had been manipulated, yes, but also someone who had chosen to be useful, who had taken money and called it redemption, who had tried to control the narrative because they couldn't stand the idea that the case might end without them being part of it. "And the rest," the detective said quietly. "You said not all of her." The contractor's face crumpled. "I didn't touch her," they insisted, a desperate burst of honesty. "I didn't." They stopped, shaking, then continued in a whisper. "He told me there were pieces, evidence, things he kept separate so nobody could ever find everything at once. He said if you ever got close, he'd still have something to trade." "Where?" the detective asked again, and the single word filled the room like a weight. The contractor's eyes slid to the wall where the maps were taped, the timelines, the headlines circled in angry marker, the phrase "cold case closed" crossed out and rewritten in red. Their voice was barely audible. "The incinerator," they said, "at the old industrial site. He worked there briefly. He said it was the cleanest eraser. He said fire doesn't testify." The detective's chest went tight. An incinerator meant finality of a kind families don't want, a disappearance made permanent, the ending stolen in the most literal way. But even that information mattered, because truth is not only bones and bodies, it's the removal of lies, the map of what happened so the mind can stop inventing its own horrors. They moved fast after that. Warrants. A search team rolling toward the derelict site in the storm. Floodlights cutting through rain like knives. Dogs working the perimeter, noses low. Handlers guiding them around crumbling concrete and rusted fencing. They found what they feared and what they needed in the same breath: records. Old logs. A maintenance sheet with his name. A small hidden compartment behind a panel, empty now but scratched, burned, the residue of something that had once been there and had been destroyed on purpose. The headlines would later say, "Ontario 2003 cold case solved. Remains recovered, accomplice arrested," and the comments would explode. People typing shock and horror like emojis could contain it. But inside the case unit the mood was not triumph. It was exhaustion. It was grief finally given a shape. They brought the personal items to the family carefully. The box sealed, handled like glass. And when the mother saw the ring, she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply reached out and touched the photograph on the evidence bag with her fingertip as if touching it might send a signal across time. Her face did something strange, relief and devastation folding into each other until they were indistinguishable. "That's hers," she whispered. And the certainty in her voice was the most painful kind because it ended the last illusion that she might still be alive somewhere, waiting. A week later, under a sky that finally cleared, they held a small service by the river. Not because the river deserved forgiveness, but because the family needed a place to stand where the story had begun. The water moved the same way it always had, indifferent and steady, and the mother watched it for a long time without speaking, as if listening for something she would never hear. The lead detective stood a few steps away, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the unfamiliar emptiness that comes when a case ends, because for years the case had been a companion, a ghost, a pressure behind every other investigation, and now the ghost had finally been given a name and a file stamp and a verdict, and still it didn't feel like victory. The maintenance contractor pled out, the details spilling into court documents that would be read and debated and summarized in podcasts. Their actions dissected by strangers hungry for meaning, but the truth was simpler and uglier. Fear and guilt had mixed with money and obsession until they became something that looked like loyalty. The convicted killer stayed behind bars, still refusing full confession, still trying to posture in interviews, still hinting at secrets that were no longer valuable because the tunnels had been mapped, the evidence recovered, the accomplice exposed. His control had been real for a long time, and then it wasn't. But even when the case closed for good, closed with remains, closed with records, closed with a timeline that finally made sense, there was one thing the detective couldn't shake, the thing that kept him staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. the way he had in the dead vein when the water surged: the wet paint. Because paint doesn't drip fresh in an abandoned tunnel on its own. Someone had been there close to the end. Someone had moved fast enough to touch the hatch edge, fast enough to plant a transmitter in the yard, fast enough to speak into the dark and tell them not to open the tote. The contractor had confessed to a lot, but not to everything, and the detective knew that sometimes the last secret isn't about the original crime. It's about the network of people who benefited from silence afterward. When the final report was filed, the case number stamped closed, the evidence logged into long-term storage, the detective drove one last time to the service road behind the river, the forgotten strip of gravel where the red circle on the map had pointed. He parked, turned off the engine, and listened. No radios, no floodlights, just wind moving through branches, just the river speaking softly through trees, just the world pretending it had never held such darkness. He stepped out, walked to the guardrail, and looked down into the brush where the storm outflow vanished into shadow. The tunnel entrance was sealed now, officially welded and reinforced, the black throat closed like a mouth forced shut. He stared at the concrete a long time, and in the fading light he saw it. Faint, almost gone, but still there if you knew where to look. A thin streak of red paint on the edge of the seal, like a fingerprint that time hadn't fully erased. The detective felt a chill slide up his spine, not because he thought the killer would return, not because he believed in ghosts, but because the human capacity for obsession is its own haunting. Cold cases don't just belong to victims and families. They attract orbiters, spectators, people who need to touch tragedy to feel alive. And some of those people don't want justice. They want ownership. He turned away from the river, got back into his car, and drove home as the first stars appeared above Ontario, small and indifferent. The case was closed. The community would heal slowly, unevenly. The family would finally have a place to lay flowers without imagining them drifting downstream. But the detective knew, deep down, that the most terrifying part of the story wasn't the verdict or the tunnels or the taunting letters. It was the fact that for years, someone had walked in the same sunlight as everyone else, smiled at neighbors, printed maps, mailed letters, painted arrows, and believed they had the right to decide how a missing woman's story would end. And in a town that had learned to lock its doors early, the river kept moving, the roads kept carrying traffic, and the word that had haunted them since 2003 remained etched into the collective memory like a headline that refuses to fade. Cold case.